The year was 1415. A chill, clinging damp seeped from the earth of northern France, a land groaning under the weight of endless conflict. The 100 Years' War, a name that echoed the futility, the sheer, grinding length of it. King Henry V of England stood atop a muddy rise, his gaze fixed on the grim silhouette dominating the horizon. Harfleur. Not just a town, a fortress. Thick stone walls, glistening wetly, rose defiantly. Towers pierced the low, gray sky. The river lizard curled around it like a sluggish, protective serpent. Henry's face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering light. His claim to the French crown rested on the point of every English arrow knocked below him. Below the ridge, sprawled like a beast roused from uneasy slumber, lay the English army. Thousands strong, yet dwarfed by the challenge ahead. Men-at-arms in dented plate armor shifted restlessly. Longbowmen, the terror of French knights, meticulously checked their yew staves and goose-feather shafts. The air hummed with tension, thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and cold iron. Mud sucked at booted feet. Horses snorted plumes of vapor into the damp air. Pennants bearing the leopards of England hung limp in the still, oppressive air. This wasn't a field for glorious cavalry charges. This was the grim business of siege. For weeks, the siege engines had groaned. Massive trebuchets, monstrous wooden skeletons, hurled stones the size of oxen against Harfleur's defiant walls. The rhythmic thud crash echoed across the sodden fields, a grim heartbeat of war. Catapults launched fiery projectiles that arced through the gray sky like falling stars, only to splutter against damp stone or ignite roofs within, sending gouts of black smoke skyward. Mining operations, desperate and dangerous, attempted to tunnel beneath the foundations, met by countermines from the stubborn French defenders. Disease, the silent killer, stalked the English camp. Dysentery, born of foul water and cramped conditions, ravaged the ranks. Men weakened, succumbed. The joyous fervor of landing had curdled into grim endurance. Within Harfleur, the defiance was equally desperate. Governor Jean de Studeville commanded the garrison, hardened veterans and determined townsfolk. Archers lined the battlements, raining arrows down on any Englishman who strayed too close. Crossbow bolts hissed through murder holes. Boiling oil and quicklime were poured onto scaling ladders. The once bustling port town echoed now with the sounds of combat. The clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, the crackle of fire, the terrified cries of civilians huddled in cellars. Food dwindled. Hope, like the autumn light, faded daily. Yet the lilies of France still flew from the highest tower. Henry, clad in functional battle gear, moved among his men. Not aloof, but present. He shared their hardships, his own royal pavilion offering little more comfort than the rough tents of his archers. His presence was a rallying point. He spoke of God's favor, of ancient rights, of the glory awaiting them beyond these accursed walls. His voice, though strained, carried conviction. One evening, by the flickering light of a brazier, he addressed his weary captains. "The walls groan," he declared, his voice low but intense. "Their resolve cracks like the mortar we chip away. One more push. One concentrated assault on the breach near the Louvre gate. We must break them before winter locks us in this mire, before sickness claims more than French steel ever could." The order rippled through the camp like an electric current. Final preparations began under cover of darkness. Ladders were checked, mantlets, large wooden shields on wheels, positioned. Knights tightened straps, muttered prayers. Archers filled their quivers. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut. Dawn approached, gray and reluctant. A heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling sound, turning shapes into phantoms. Perfect cover, perfect terror. Then, a horn blast, sharp and clear, shattered the pre-dawn stillness. It was the signal. A roar erupted from thousands of English throats, a raw, guttural sound of fear and fury mingled. They surged forward, a human tide crashing against the stone shore of Harfleur. From the walls, French defenders, bleary-eyed but ready, loosed a storm of arrows and bolts. Shafts thudded into shields, found gaps in armor. Men fell swallowed by the mud. But the tide didn't stop. Mantlets rumbled forward, providing scant cover. Ladders scraped and clanged against the stone as men scrambled upwards, desperate to gain the battlements. Above, French pikemen thrust downwards. Swords clanged on armor. Screams, English and French, merged into a horrific symphony. Henry himself was near the thickest fighting at the Loire breach. He fought not as a distant monarch, but as a soldier king, his sword a blur of steel. Around him, his household knights formed a living shield, battling fiercely against French men-at-arms countercharging into the gap. It was brutal, intimate carnage. The mist swirled with blood spray. The din was deafening, metal on metal, war cries, death rattles, the sickening thud of impacts. Step by agonizing step, the English pushed forward, buying precious inches with blood and bone. High on the walls, D'Estouteville watched the relentless pressure at the breach. He saw his brave men being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and English ferocity. He saw flames licking at buildings near the gatehouse, threatening to spread chaos. He saw the exhaustion etched on every face. The toll of weeks of siege, the dwindling resources, the relentless English assault. It was too much. The cost to his people, to his town, would be annihilation. With a heavy heart, a heart burdened by duty and despair, he gave the order no commander ever wishes to give. A trumpet sounded from the keep. Not a call to arms, but a mournful, descending note. Cease fighting. Slowly, agonizingly, the clamor of battle subsided. The clash of steel gave way to the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fires. French soldiers, disbelief warring with relief on their faces, lowered their weapons. On the breach, bloodied English soldiers paused, chests heaving, leaning on swords or lances, too exhausted for immediate triumph. The mist began to lift, revealing the horrific cost littering the ground before the shattered walls. Henry, breathing heavily, wiped blood, not his own, from his blade. He looked up at the tower where the lilies of France now hung limp. Moments later, they began their slow descent. In their place, the leopards of England were raised. A ragged cheer went up from the English ranks, hoarse and weary. Harfleur had fallen. The first, brutal step on Henry's march to destiny was complete. But the fields were soaked in red, and the road ahead, towards a place called Agincourt, promised only more bloodshed beneath the weeping skies of France. The siege was over. The war, far from it. The cost of a crown is measured not in gold, but in the mud and blood of places like Harfleur. Story note: the air crackled with the end of an age. Constantinople, May 1453. For 1,000 years, the mighty walls of the Queen of Cities had stood defiant. The last jewel of the Roman Empire, now Byzantium, a flickering flame against an encroaching tide. Sultan Mehmed II, young, brilliant, consumed by destiny, gazed upon the Theodosian walls, a triple barrier of stone and legend. His vast Ottoman host, a sea of tents and banners, choked the land beyond. Cannons, monstrous new engines of war forged by Orban the Hungarian, stood like iron demons, already scarring the ancient stonework with their brutal kisses. The die was cast. The final siege had begun. Inside the city, desperation hung thick as the smoke from Ottoman bombardments. Emperor Constantine XI Dragis's Palaiologos, the last of his name, moved among his pitifully outnumbered defenders. Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, barely 7,000 against 80,000. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and a grim understanding. The walls, once deemed impregnable, groaned under the relentless pounding. Great chunks of masonry cascaded into the ditches. The earth trembled. The once proud towers leaned precariously. Constantine, clad not in imperial purple but in the armor of a common soldier, knew the weight of 12 centuries rested on his shoulders. "We stand for Christendom," he declared, his voice hoarse but firm, echoing along the battlements. "For Rome, for our homes, there is no retreat." Mehmed orchestrated his assault with chilling precision. Night and day, the cannons roared, their thunder shaking the very foundations of Hagia Sophia. Stone dust choked the air, mingling with the acrid tang of gunpowder and the stench of fear. Ottoman engineers filled the great protective ditch under cover of darkness, inch by bloody inch, while arrows blotted out the sun. Wave after wave of Mem's disciplined troops, Azaps, Anatolians, fierce irregulars, hurled themselves against the breaches. Scaling ladders rose like skeletal fingers against the battered walls. The defenders, fueled by despair and faith, met them with boiling pitch, Greek fire, rocks, and desperate courage. The ditches ran red. The nights were lit by funeral pyres and the screams of the dying. For 55 days, the city endured. Hope dwindled like the last drops of oil in a lamp. Food grew scarce. Rumors whispered of Venetian relief fleets just beyond the horizon, tantalizingly out of reach. Some spoke of betrayal of unlocked gates. Yet, Constantine held the line. He patrolled the walls constantly, rallying his men, plugging gaps with rubble and resolve. His presence was a beacon, a flicker of defiance against the Ottoman storm. In the Hagia Sophia, priests chanted ceaselessly, the haunting hymns rising above the din of battle, a plea to a seemingly silent heaven. Then came the night of May 28th. An eerie silence descended, heavier than the bombardment. It was the calm before the cataclysm. Mehmed announced his final, all-out assault. Torches flared like malevolent stars across the Ottoman camp. Drums began a relentless, primal beat, thrumming through the darkness, vibrating in the chests of the defenders. Inside the city, Constantine ordered the great church bells to toll, a mournful, defiant knell echoing over the hushed city. He gathered his nobles, his foreign captains, his remaining loyal guard. They partook of a final communion, not as emperor and subjects, but as brothers facing oblivion. "Let us die bravely," Constantine said, embracing them one by one, his eyes holding the sorrow of an empire's end. For our faith, for our city, for each other. Before dawn on May 29th, the drums reached a frenzied crescendo. Then silence. A single, piercing horn blast shattered the night. The Ottoman host surged forward, a tsunami of humanity crashing against the shattered walls. First came the Bashi Bazooks, the irregulars, expendable waves meant to exhaust the defenders. They clambered over rubble, fell screaming into hidden pits, were cut down by arrows and stones. Then came the disciplined Anatolian troops, pressing harder, testing the limits. The defenders fought like demons possessed, repelling assault after assault. The air was thick with arrows, crossbow bolts, the clash of steel, the guttural cries of battle. Finally, Mehmed unleashed his ultimate weapon, the elite Janissaries. 12,000 strong, fanatically loyal, superbly trained. They advanced like a steel tide, their war cries chilling the blood. They flowed towards the breaches, particularly a critical gap near the Blacherny Palace and the infamous Kirkaporta Gate. The fighting descended into brutal, close-quarter slaughter. Men grappled hand-to-hand on piles of rubble slick with blood. Constantine fought personally in the thickest press, his sword flashing, his banner held high, surrounded by his dwindling guard. The fatal blow came not from the main breach, but from a small, forgotten postern gate, the Kirkaporta. Left open, perhaps by negligence or treachery, it allowed a small band of Janissaries to infiltrate, climbing inside and raising the Ottoman banner atop a tower. A cry of terror went up from the Byzantine lines. The city is taken. Panic, swift and lethal, ripped through the exhausted defenders. Resistance began to crumble. Seeing the Ottoman banner, more Janissaries poured through the main breaches, overwhelming the faltering lines. Constantine, realizing the end, tore off his imperial insignia. Drawing his sword, he plunged into the mass of Janissaries near the St. Romanus Gate. "Is there no Christian to take my head?" he was heard to cry. He vanished into the maelstrom, an emperor dying as a common soldier, his body never found. The sun rose on a city in its death throes. Ottoman soldiers flooded through the streets. The great gates were forced open. Sack began. Hagia Sophia, the heart of orthodoxy for a millennium, saw its doors battered down. The last mass was interrupted as Janissaries tore through the sanctuary, desecrating icons, slaughtering those seeking sanctuary. The cries of the conquered mixed with the triumphant shouts of the conquerors. Mehmed too rode into his new capital, Fatih, the conqueror, Constantinople, the The city of Constantine, the new Rome, was no more. In its place stood Istanbul. The Eastern Roman Empire, born centuries before, breathed its last on that Tuesday morning. The fall of the city echoed across Christendom, marking not just the end of an empire, but the violent dawn of a new world order. The Middle Ages gasped its final breath upon the blood-soaked stones of Byzantium. Story number 3. The Siege of Acre, 1191. The Levantine sun beat down, relentless. Summer, 1191. Acre. Not just a city, a festering wound, a crucible of desperation where the Third Crusade's fate hung by a thread. 2 years. 2 bloody years the combined forces of Christendom, Franks, Germans, English, French, had choked this vital port, held fiercely by Saladin's Ayyubid defenders. The air reeked, salt spray, rotting refuse, unburied dead, and the constant tang of smoke. Inside the double walls, Muslim resolve hardened by faith and Saladin's encircling relief army. Outside, the Crusader camp, a sprawling, disease-ridden testament to fading hope and boiling frustration. King Richard the Lionheart of England, newly arrived, surveyed the grim tableau. His piercing blue eyes missed nothing: the skeletal siege towers, the scarred land, the haunted faces. Acre had to fall. The road to Jerusalem began here or ended. Richard's energy was volcanic. He brought fresh troops, formidable siege engines, and ruthless focus. Gone was the lethargy. Work intensified under the punishing sun. Carpenters hammered day and night, constructing massive new mangonels and a fearsome siege tower. Malvoisin, the bad neighbor. Miners, shielded by catapult barrages, gnawed at the foundations of the formidable curse tower. The air filled anew with the scream of projectiles, the shuddering crump of stone on stone, the shouts of engineers, and the ceaseless cries of the wounded. Saladin's forces redoubled their efforts. Sorties erupted from Acre's gates, clashing violently with Crusader outposts. Archers dueled across the shattered no-man's land. Greek fire, the terrifying liquid flame, arced from the walls, setting wooden siege works ablaze, illuminating the night with hellish light. The ditches became charnel pits. Disease, however, remained the silent sultan. Dysentery and typhoid ravaged the Crusader camp more effectively than any Saracen blade. Men died in droves, their strength leaching into the fetid ground. Tensions flared between the proud leaders: Richard, Philip Augustus of France, Leopold V of Austria. Arguments over strategy, spoils, and command echoed in royal pavilions. Yet the sheer force of Richard's will held them barely on course. He fought alongside his men, his legendary prowess lifting morale. He directed the bombardment with cold precision, concentrating fury on the battered curse tower. The defenders, led by fierce emirs, fought with the courage of the doomed. They repaired breaches with rubble and bodies, hurled down stones and burning pitch, their defiance echoing the muezzin's call to prayer that still rose, hauntingly, from within the beleaguered city. July 11th. The climax. Weeks of concentrated bombardment had finally told. A critical section of the outer wall near the cursed tower groaned, shuddered, and collapsed in a thunderous roar of dust and debris. A gaping wound opened. A roar erupted from the Crusader ranks, hurrah, primal, born of 2 years of pent-up agony and the scent of victory. Richard, clad in chainmail, raised his great sword. For God and the Holy Sepulchre, now! The assault surged forward. Knights and sergeants, a tide of steel and desperation, poured towards the breach. Scaling ladders slammed against the inner wall. Fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted on the rubble-strewn slope. Saracen defenders met them with savage intensity, scimitars flashing, spears thrusting. The narrow breach became a meat grinder. Bodies piled high. The din was infernal, war cries in a dozen tongues, the shriek of metal, the screams of men and horses caught in the press. Richard fought like a force of nature near the breach, his sword cleaving a path. Beside him, the French and Austrians pressed hard. High above, on the inner ramparts, Acre's commanders saw the inevitable. Their supplies were exhausted, their men spent. Saladin's relief army hammered the Crusader perimeter but could not break through to save them. The sight of the Bad Neighbor siege tower looming ominously close to the inner wall, its drawbridge ready to drop, sealed their fate. Hope extinguished. White flags, patches of surrender cloth, began to appear on the battlements. The fierce Saracen cries faltered, replaced by a chilling silence that spread like a wave across the carnage. Fighting stuttered, then ceased. Men stood panting, drenched in blood and sweat, leaning on weapons, disbelief warring with exhaustion on their faces. Acre had fallen. The next day, under a harsh sun, terms were dictated. The garrison, 1,000 strong, would surrender. Their lives were forfeit to Crusader mercy. Saladin's banners were torn down. The standards of the cross, Richard's lions, Philip's fleur-de-lis, Leopold's stripes, were raised over the shattered towers. A ragged, weary cheer went up from the Crusader host. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands dead from combat and disease over 2 grueling years. The city lay in ruins, its streets choked with debris and the stench of death. And the question of the prisoners festered like an open wound. Weeks later, driven by perceived betrayal and logistical impossibility, Richard would make his infamous, brutal decision, sealing Acre's fall with a final act of savagery that would stain the crusade and echo down the centuries. The path to Jerusalem was open, but it was paved with the broken stones of Acre and drenched in blood. The Lionheart had his victory, but the holy city remained a distant mirage, shimmering beyond a desert of sacrifice and moral compromise. The siege was over. The reckoning had just begun. Story number 4, The Battle of Stirling Bridge, 1297. Dawn, September 11, 1297. A chill, clinging mist rose from the tidal waters of the River Forth, coiling like a spectral serpent around the ancient wooden bridge near Stirling Castle. Scotland held its breath. The weight of English oppression, heavy taxes, displaced lords, the humiliation of a nation subjugated, pressed down like the low grey clouds. Edward I, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, sought to extinguish their spirit. His vast army, a terrifying display of imperial might, filled the southern bank. Thousands of heavily armored knights atop destriers, disciplined men-at-arms in gleaming chainmail, and the lethal Welsh longbowmen whose arrows had broken armies. Commanded by the complacent Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, and the despised, corpulent treasurer Hugh de Cressingham, hated for his extortion, they awaited the order to cross. Facing them, concealed amongst the craggy outcrops and gorse of the Abbey Craig, not a traditional army, but Scotland incarnate. Farmers gripping spears tipped with scythe blades, smiths wielding hammers, lesser nobles with ancestral swords, townsfolk armed with axes and desperation. Led by the towering, flame-haired William Wallace, whose very presence radiated defiant fury, and the astute, battle-scarred Andrew de Moray, a nobleman who'd seen his lands seized. This was a force forged in righteous anger, united not by feudal oath, but by the burning need to reclaim their home. That narrow, groaning bridge was the fulcrum upon which Scotland's fate would pivot. Warenne dithered, arrogance warring with unease. Scouts reported the Scots were few, poorly armored, foolishly positioned on the far side. Why risk the bottleneck? Could they ford the river downstream? Precious morning hours bled away in heated debate within the English command tent, while the hosts sweltered under the weight of their plate and chainmail on the boggy southern bank. Cressingham, bloated with self-importance and desperate to save the king's purse the cost of prolonged campaigning, grew apoplectic. "Cross, my lord. By God, cross now. These ragged brigands cannot stand before English steel. Delay drains the treasury." His shrill impatience finally pierced Warenne's indecision. The fatal order echoed. The ancient wooden structure, its timbers slick with dew, groaned under the weight of the first English vanguard. Knights in brilliant heraldry, sergeants grim-faced, their massive warhorses snorting plumes of vapor, began the agonizingly slow procession. 2 abreast was all the bridge allowed. They funneled across, emerging onto the cramped, marshy northern floodplain, the Carse of Stirling. Thick mist clung to the low ground, swirling like a shroud, obscuring the thousands of Scottish eyes watching from the heights, hearts pounding like war drums in their chests. Wallace and Moray stood shoulder to shoulder, a study in contrasting resolve. Wallace, a mountain of controlled rage; Moray, calculating, cold. Timing was everything. They needed to let enough English cross to cripple their army, but not so many they could deploy properly on the Carse. Let the bridge be their cage. Their men, packed in tight schiltrons, dense formations anchored by long spears, pikes forged from forest ash, tips hardened in blacksmiths' forges, gripped their weapons, knuckles white. They were butchers, bakers, fathers, sons, fueled by stories of burned crofts and violated kin. Wallace's gaze, sharp as a falcon's, tracked the enemy numbers swelling on the Carse. 2,000? 3,000 glittering targets, compressed, confused, their formation unraveling in the confined space? The relentless creak groan of the bridge was a death chant for the crossing. Still the English came, banners of lions and chevrons held high, confidence turning to unease as the mist refused to lift and the far slopes remained ominously silent. Then, Wallace's hand slashed down. A single, piercing blast from a Carnick's horn tore the silence, a sound like a damned soul screaming. From the slopes of the Abbey Craig, the very hillside seemed to erupt. Down they surged, not in a wild Highland charge, but with terrifying, drilled discipline. Schiltrons locked tight, spears lowered into a deadly, impenetrable forest of steel points. They hit the English vanguard like a tsunami of wrath. Destriers screamed, skewered on 12-foot shafts. Knights, encased in steel, crashed to the boggy ground, helpless as Scottish axes and Claydheim more great swords rose and fell with brutal efficiency. For Scotland, for Wallace, the roar shook the earth. The schiltrons held, advancing step by bloody step, compressing the English into a suffocating mass. There was no room for cavalry charges, no space to swing a broadsword. English discipline shattered into panicked chaos on the treacherous, sucking ground. Men stumbled over fallen comrades, trampled in the mud. Back at the bridge, horror unfolded. English troops mid-crossing saw the slaughter ahead, a seething mass of their own men being butchered. Those trying to retreat collided headlong with those still blindly advancing on narrow timbers. The bridge became a scene of nightmarish carnage. Armored men, packed like sardines, were pushed screaming into the Forth's cold embrace, vanishing under the weight of their own mail. Welsh archers, useless at close quarters, were dragged down and slaughtered. Cressingham, conspicuous on his expensive charger, floundered in the melee. Recognized by his rich robes and girth, Scottish fighters swarmed him. The leech, the treasurer. He was hauled from his saddle. History records no mercy. His body was flayed, his skin reputedly cut into strips, a grim trophy and a saddle girth for Wallace. Surrey, witnessing the annihilation from the southern bank, turned ashen. His nerve evaporated. Instead of committing reserves or attempting a desperate rescue across the ford, he gave the only order his terror allowed: retreat. Save yourselves. He wheeled his horse, spurs drawing blood, fleeing south towards the border, abandoning thousands to their doom. The battle dissolved into a merciless slaughter. Trapped between the relentless, advancing schiltrons and the churning, uncrossable river, the elite English force on the north bank had nowhere to go. The Carse became a charnel house. Men died by spear thrust, crushed underfoot, cleaved by axes, or drowned in the Forth, their heavy armor dragging them into the murky depths. The river ran thick and red, choked with bodies and debris. The bridge itself, overloaded and battered by panic-stricken men and collapsing horses, groaned, splintered, and partially gave way, sealing the fate of those still trapped. By midday, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the groans of the dying and the harsh cries of carrion birds already circling. Thousands of English dead littered the Carse, piled high on the broken bridge, and floated in the crimson current. Scottish casualties were miraculously light. Wallace and Moray stood amidst the carnage, surveying the field, a tableau of impossible victory forged from courage and cunning. The stench of blood, voided bowels, and terror hung heavy in the suddenly still air. News of Stirling Bridge exploded across Scotland like wildfire. It wasn't merely a victory, It was a seismic shock, shattering the myth of English invincibility. Wallace and Moray became instant, towering legends, symbols of a nation rediscovering its fierce heart. Stirling Castle, its garrison shattered and isolated, surrendered days later without a fight. Scotland, for a glorious, defiant moment, stood free. Edward Longshank's iron grip was broken. The victory proved a people united by desperation, fighting for hearth and home with terrain and timing as their weapons, could humble an empire. But the cost was etched into the very land. The shattered skeleton of the bridge, the carrion-strewn carse reeking for weeks, the Forth stained. And in distant London, Edward's rage would be volcanic. His retribution would be terrible, his vengeance absolute. Yet, on that misty, bloody September morning, against crushing odds, the lion had roared at Stirling Bridge. Scotland breathed the sharp, clear air of freedom, however fleeting it might prove. The shadow of Longshanks lengthened, but the flame of resistance, once a flicker, now burned as bright as Wallace's hair against the dark moor. Story number 5, The Battle of Hastings. A blood-red comet slashed the English sky. 1066, a year etched in destiny. King Harold Godwin's son, crowned mere months, faced a kingdom besieged. In the north, the thunder of Viking axes, Harold Hardrada and Harold's own brother, Tostig, shattered his army at Fulford Gate. With desperate speed, Harold marched his housecarls, elite warriors bound by oath, 190 miles in 4 days. At Stamford Bridge, beneath the September sun, he unleashed hell. Hardrada fell. Tostig died. The Viking host was annihilated, but victory's echo was cut short. News rushed south. William, Duke of Normandy, the bastard claimant, had landed at Pevensey. Harold turned his weary men towards a new storm. Dawn, October 14th. Senlac Hill, near Hastings. Exhaustion hung heavy on the English ranks. They'd marched back over 250 miles in brutal weeks. No rest. Now, they stood shield to shield atop a steep, muddy slope, a human fortress. Housecarls in the center, their massive double-handed axes gleaming dully, flanked by the Effi, farmers and freemen armed with spears, bills, and sheer determination. Their formation, the impenetrable shield wall. Harold planted his standards, the fighting man and the dragon of Wessex, at the crest. Below, marshland and streams hemmed them in. Behind, dense forest. No retreat. England's fate rested on this ridge. William's Norman host spread across the lower ground like a malevolent tapestry. Knights in gleaming mail hauberks, mounted on powerful destriers, a terrifying force England rarely faced. Archers, crossbowmen, and disciplined infantry completed the grim picture. William, shorter than legend claims but radiating fierce charisma, rallied his men. He promised land, glory, God's favor. He claimed Harold was an oath-breaker, sworn on holy relics to support his claim. The air crackled with tension, thick with the smell of damp earth, leather, and cold fear. Priests moved through the Norman ranks, blessing warriors. The Duke raised his sword. Trumpets blared. The Norman advance began. First came the archers. A deadly rain of arrows whistled upwards, darkening the sky before plunging towards the English shield wall. The most found wood and leather, shields held high. Few gaps appeared. Norman infantry surged next, clambering up the slippery slope, shouting curses. They crashed against the English line. A roar erupted, a visceral sound of impact, wood on wood, metal on metal. The shield wall held. Axes rose and fell with sickening thuds. Norman infantry recoiled, stumbling back down the hill, leaving dead and wounded in the churned mud. English jeers followed them. Confidence flickered on the ridge. William saw his infantry repulsed. Time for the knights. He signaled the cavalry charge. The ground trembled as hundreds of armored horsemen spurred their massive destriers up the slope. It was a sight to freeze blood. Lances lowered, they aimed for the wall. But the hill was steep, the ground treacherous. Horses faltered. The shield wall, braced, spears thrusting forward like a steel thicket, held firm. Axes wielded by housecarls smashed through armor, carving horrific wounds. Horses screamed, impaled or hamstrung. Riders fell, crushed under their mounts or dragged down and slaughtered. The charge broke, dissolving into chaos. Panic surged through the Norman ranks. A cry went up, "The Duke is slain!" Despair threatened to rout them. William, unhorsed but alive, tore off his helmet. "Look at me! I live. By God's grace, we conquer!" His raw courage stemmed the tide. He rallied his knights, reformed the lines. He unleashed a new tactic, the feigned retreat. Groups of knights suddenly wheeled, seemingly fleeing down the hill in disarray. A roar of triumph went up from sections of the English FRD on the flanks. Discipline, strained by exhaustion and the sight of fleeing enemies, snapped. Eager for easy kills, they broke ranks, surging down the slope after the rout. It was a fatal mistake. Instantly, the fleeing Normans wheeled. Archers pivoted. Trapped on open ground, the pursuing Efoi were cut down mercilessly by arrows and countercharging knights. The shield wall was fatally weakened. William exploited the breach relentlessly. Arrow storms intensified, targeting the thinning English center where Harold stood. Cavalry charges, now coordinated with infantry pushes, hammered the compromised wall. The fighting descended into brutal, close-quarter slaughter. The slope became a morass of blood, mud, and fallen men. Harold fought ferociously beside his brothers, Leofwine and Deutsch, but the Norman pressure was unrelenting. Hour bled into hour. English strength waned. Then, the legend, an arrow, fate's cruel dart, found its mark. It struck Harold high in the face, possibly blinding him. He staggered. Norman knights surged forward, hacking down the wounded king near his standards. His housecarls died to the last man defending his body. The Dragon of Wessex fell. With Harold dead, English resistance crumbled. The shield wall shattered. The remnants of the FRD fled into the darkening woods, pursued by vengeful Normans. William, his gambit won at horrific cost, stood victorious on the blood-soaked ridge. Senlac Hill was littered with the flower of English nobility and common folk alike. William pitched his tent on the spot where Harold fell. The next day, he marched towards London. Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, though the ceremony echoed with terrified shouts outside. The Anglo-Saxon age was over. The Norman conquest had begun. A new aristocracy, a new language, a new era imposed by the sword on the muddy slopes of Hastings. The comet's warning had been fulfilled. England belonged to the bastard. Story number 6, The Siege of Orleans and Joan of Arc's Triumph, 1429. The winter of 1428-29 gripped Orleans in an iron fist of despair. The 100 Years' War ground on, a century of blood and broken kingdoms. England, ascendant, seemed poised to strangle France. Orleans, the last great loyal city north of the Loire, was the linchpin. Fall, and the path to Bourges, where the uncrowned Dauphin Charles cowered, lay open. English siege lines, commanded by the Earl of Salisbury and later Suffolk, tightened like a noose. Bastilles bristling with cannons ringed the city. The Burgundian Gate, the Tourelles fortress guarding the southern bridge, all seized. French sorties grew desperate, costly failures. Inside the walls, starvation gnawed, hope dwindled. Cannons boomed relentlessly, day and night, shaking the very stones. Orleans was dying. France seemed doomed to become an English province. Then a rumor, wild as spring wind. A maid, sent by God. From Domremy. On March 29, 1429, she arrived. 17 years old, clad in white armor, her dark hair cropped short, bearing a banner depicting Christ and angels. Her eyes burned with an unshakable conviction. I am sent by the King of Heaven to raise the siege of Orleans and lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. Skepticism met her. Warlords like Dunois, bastard of Orleans, and La Hire scowled. But her certainty, her simple piety, her uncanny knowledge of secret prayers known only to the Dauphin, began to erode doubt. The people saw a savior. Joan brought not just herself, but a surge of divine fervor. She dictated a letter to the English commanders, "Depart in God's name, or I will drive you out." They laughed, called her a witch, a whore. They would regret their mockery. Joan transformed the paralyzed garrison. She expelled the prostitutes following the army, demanded confession, banned blasphemy. She infused the demoralized soldiers with an electric belief. On May 4th, spurred by a vision, she demanded action. Dumas, initially hesitant, saw the fire in her eyes, the sudden resolve in the men. They sallied. Joan, banner held high, rode at their head, not to fight, she claimed, but to lead. Their target, the isolated Bastille of Saint-Lô east of the city. The assault was ferocious. Joan spurred them on, crying, "Have faith! God gives us victory!" Against all odds, the Bastille fell. A crucial English outpost silenced. A roar went up from the city walls. The Maid had struck the first blow. Hope, long extinguished, flickered back to life. 2 days later, May 6th, Joan turned her gaze south, to the mighty fortress complex guarding the bridge approach. Les Augustines and, beyond it, the formidable stone tower of Les Tourelles. Taking these meant breaking the southern stranglehold. The assault on Les Augustines was brutal. English archers rained death. French knights faltered under the storm. Joan plunged into the chaos, rallying the retreating men. "Press on. When you see my banner touch the wall, the place is yours." Her courage was infectious. They rallied, surged forward, and overwhelmed the defenders. Les Augustines was theirs, but the true challenge loomed, Les Tourelles. A massive stone keep rising beside the ruined bridge, its drawbridge raised, moat deep, walls thick. It was the anchor of the English southern line. On May 7th, the assault on Les Tourelles began. All day, the French hurled themselves against the impregnable walls. Scaling ladders were pushed up, only to be cast down amidst showers of arrows, stones, and boiling oil. Joan, ever at the front, was wounded, an arrow piercing her shoulder above the breast. She cried out, was pulled from the fray. English jeers echoed from the ramparts. The French assault wavered, leaders argued for retreat. Joan, grimacing in pain, had the arrow pulled out. She prayed fervently. Then, against all advice, she mounted her horse. "Rest? I shall not rest until we are inside. Sound the charge. The place is ours." Her return, bloodied but unbowed, reignited the assault with furious intensity. As twilight deepened, the fighting reached a savage crescendo. Joan planted her banner on the edge of the moat. When the banner touches the wall, enter. Legend claims she prophesied the death of the main English commander, Glassdale, who moments later fell from the drawbridge into the moat and drowned in his heavy armor. French troops, inspired beyond fear, finally forced their way onto the drawbridge and battered through a postern gate. Hand-to-hand combat erupted within the tower. By nightfall, Les Tourelles was French. Flames consumed the fortress, a beacon of victory visible for miles. The next morning, May 8th, dawn revealed a stunned English army. Their strongest bastion was a smoldering ruin. Their commander dead. Their will broken. Joan, armored and radiant despite her wound, rode out before the city gates. The English host, drawn up in battle array on the plain, stood motionless. They watched her. No challenge came. No trumpet sounded for attack. For an hour, an eerie silence held. Then, slowly, deliberately, the English began to strike camp. Banners furled. Wagons loaded. They marched away, northwards, abandoning their siege lines, their cannons, their wounded. Orleans was free. The impossible had happened. The Maid had done it. Cheers erupted from the city walls. Tears streamed down gaunt faces. Bells pealed across Orleans, a joyous clamor that hadn't been heard for 7 months. Joan entered the city not as a warrior, but as a deliverer, hailed by throngs weeping with gratitude. The siege of Orleans was broken. In 9 days, a peasant girl had achieved what seasoned generals could not. The strategic tide of the 100 Years' War turned irrevocably. Charles VII, spurred by this miracle, found his spine. Joan led him to Reims, to his coronation. France had found its heart, its soul, its warrior saint. The legend of the Maid of Orleans was born on that blood-soaked bridge, forged in fire and faith, echoing through history as proof that even in the darkest hour, courage guided by conviction can move mountains or break sieges. Story number 7, The Siege of Vienna. 1529, the tide turns at the gates of Christendom. September rains choked the roads to mud. 1529, an empire of shadows stretched westward. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottomans, commander of the faithful, led a force unlike Europe had ever seen. Over 120,000 strong. Elite janissaries with matchless discipline, Spahi cavalry swirling like desert storms, siege engineers, and the terrifying rumble of massive bronze cannon. Their goal? Vienna. The glittering prize, the golden apple, the very heart of Central Europe. Capture it, and the road to Germany lay open. Christendom trembled. After crushing Hungary at Mohacs, Suleiman's juggernaut seemed unstoppable. Panic raced ahead of the Ottoman host. Refugees choked the Danube. Vienna prepared for oblivion. Inside the ancient walls, desperation warred with grim resolve. Commanded by the seasoned German mercenary, Nicholas Graf Somme, barely 20,000 defenders, German landsknechts, Spanish arquebusiers, Austrian knights, and armed citizens faced annihilation. Time was their only ally. Could they hold until relief arrived from the fractured German states? Somme acted with ruthless efficiency. He ordered the suburbs razed. Homes, churches, gardens, everything outside the formidable medieval walls was burned, creating a desolate killing field. Ditches were deepened, bastions strengthened. Every citizen, man, woman, even child, was mobilized, carrying earth, forging shot, preparing boiling oil and pitch. The air hung heavy with smoke, fear, and the unshakable dread of the approaching storm. Vienna became a fortress of last hope, huddled beneath leaden skies. On September 27th, the horizon darkened. Not with clouds, but with the Ottoman host. Tents blossomed like a malignant fungus, encircling the city. The siege began not with thunderous cannonade, but with insidious mining. Ottoman sappers, masters of their dark craft, began tunneling beneath Vienna's walls, seeking to plant devastating gunpowder charges. Somme, anticipating this, ordered countermines. Underground, a silent, claustrophobic war raged in pitch-black tunnels. Men fought with picks, knives, and suffocating smoke pots in terrifying close quarters. Above, the first Ottoman artillery opened fire. The thunderous boom of massive bombards shook the city, their stone shot gouging craters in ancient stonework. The defenders replied with their own cannon, targeting the Ottoman siege lines, trying to silence the guns threatening their walls. October arrived, bringing biting cold and relentless rain. Suleiman, frustrated by the stubborn resistance and the slow progress of his sappers, ordered massive assaults. Wave after wave of Anatolian infantry and irregular azaps hurled themselves across the desolate suburbs towards the breaches opened by the guns. They were met by withering volleys of arquebus fire from the ramparts, scything down ranks. Boiling oil and water cascaded onto scaling ladders. The ditches filled with Ottoman dead. Yet, they came on, driven by faith and the Sultan's will. The defenders, soaked, exhausted, their numbers dwindling from snipers and disease, held the walls with desperate tenacity. Somme, wounded by a falling stone splinter, commanded from a litter, his resolve unbroken. The city's spirit was embodied in the defiant tolling of St. Stephen's Cathedral bell, a constant, haunting reminder of what they fought for. Suleiman gambled. On October 11th and 12th, he unleashed his ultimate weapon, the janissaries. The Sultan's own slave soldiers, the finest infantry in the world, advanced with chilling discipline. Preceded by volleys of arrows that darkened the sky, they stormed the main breach near the Corinthian gate. The fighting descended into brutal, hand-to-hand carnage on the rubble-strewn slopes. Landsnecked pikes met janissary scimitars in a whirlwind of steel. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Somme, dragged to the breach, rallied his men. Civilians hurled stones, poured burning pitch. The narrow breach became a charnel house, Ottoman bodies piling high, yet still they pressed. Just as the defense seemed ready to buckle, a desperate countercharge by Austrian knights, swords flashing in the gloom, drove the Janissaries back from the very lip of victory. The breach held barely. The failed Janissary assault broke the Ottoman spirit. Winter's grip tightened. Rain turned to sleet. Supplies dwindled in the vast camp. Disease, dysentery, and typhus ravaged the Ottoman ranks far worse than Habsburg steel. News arrived of German and Bohemian forces finally mustering, approaching down the Danube. Suleiman, the Magnificent, faced a bitter choice: risk his army and prestige in a prolonged, freezing siege against a city that refused to die, or retreat. The unthinkable became necessary. On the night of October 14th, under cover of darkness and a final, furious bombardment meant to mask their departure, the Ottoman host began to melt away. They abandoned vast quantities of supplies, siege guns, even their wounded. The greatest army Islam could send against Christendom was retreating. Dawn on October 15th revealed an eerie silence. The sea of tents was gone. Only smoldering campfires and the horrific detritus of siege remained. Cautious scouts confirmed it. A ragged, disbelieving cheer rose from the battered walls of Vienna, swelling into a roar of exhausted triumph. Church bells, silent during the siege, pealed out across the liberated city, a joyous, defiant clamor echoing the salvation of Christendom. The tide of Ottoman conquest, which had swept to the very gates of Europe, had been halted. Vienna stood. Nicholas Graf Somme, the crippled defender, died weeks later from his wounds, a hero. Suleiman would return, but never with such overwhelming force or such clear advantage. The siege of Vienna in 1529 marked a turning point. It proved the Ottomans could be stopped. It bought Christendom precious time, cemented Habsburg power, and echoed down the centuries as the moment the East recoiled from the West's resilient heart. The golden apple remained just out of the Sultan's grasp, its shine undimmed by smoke and blood. Story number 8, The Siege of Malta, 1565, the shield of Christendom. The Mediterranean sun, May 1565, blazed down on a barren rock about to become hell. A desolate island fortress, Christendom's southernmost bulwark. Facing it, the mightiest armada since antiquity, 200 Ottoman ships carrying near 40,000 warriors, Janissaries, Sipahis, corsairs, hardened veterans of empire. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, enraged by past defeats, demanded its obliteration. Remove this thorn. His commander, Mustafa Pasha, veteran of Rhodes, and the legendary corsair admiral, Dragut, aimed to erase the Knights Hospitaller, the defiant hounds of war. Grand Master Jean Parasat de la Valette, 70 years old but forged in steel, commanded a pitiful force, 500 knights, 4,000 Maltese militia, 1,000 mercenaries. 9,000 souls against a tidal wave. Their mission, hold or see Rome undefended. The knights chose their ground. Fort St. Elmo, a tiny star fort guarding Marsamxet harbor's entrance. Valette knew it was doomed, but its sacrifice could buy time. St. Elmo must fall, he declared grimly, but it will cost them dear. On May 24th, the Ottoman guns roared. Massive bombards pounded the fort's limestone walls, shaking the very island. Wave after wave of elite Janissaries stormed the breaches. Inside, 150 knights and 600 soldiers fought with fanatical desperation. They repelled assault after assault, turning the fort into a charnel house. Dragut, arriving mid-siege, intensified the fury. Days bled into weeks. The fort crumbled, defenders fought from ruins, hurling rocks, boiling oil, and prayers. Valette watched helplessly from Burgu, sending nightly boatloads of volunteers, replacements walking knowingly to their death. After 31 days of unimaginable carnage, St. Elmo fell on June 23rd. Not a single defender survived. Dragut lay mortally wounded by a stray shot. Mustafa, surveying the carnage, reportedly wept at the cost. 8,000 Ottomans dead for a shattered rock. Valette's grim calculus worked. Precious weeks were bought. But the storm merely shifted. On July 15th, the Ottoman fury turned on the twin peninsulas, Senlia and Burgu, the knights' main strongholds. Massive assaults crashed against the land walls. Janissary scaling ladders rose like serpents against the scarred bastions. The defenders met them with point-blank arquebus fire, pikes, rocks, and Greek fire, liquid hell that clung and burned. Valette, armored and implacable, was everywhere, rallying men, plugging breaches with rubble and resolve. Maltese women and children fought alongside, carrying water, ammunition, stones, and tending the wounded. The air hung thick with smoke, the stench of gunpowder, rotting corpses, and the metallic tang of blood. Disease festered in both camps under the relentless sun. Water grew scarce. Hope dwindled like the dwindling supplies of shot. Mustafa unleashed his engineers. Sappers tunneled beneath the walls of Burgu, planting massive mines. On August 7th, a colossal explosion ripped open the post of Castile. Ottoman troops poured into the breach, screaming, "Allahu Akbar." It was the critical moment. Panic threatened. Valette, sword drawn, plunged into the breach with his personal guard, old men and pages. "Stand fast. For faith. For the order," he roared. His white mantle, emblazoned with the cross, became a beacon. Knights, soldiers, civilians rallied in a ferocious countercharge. Hand-to-hand fighting raged in the shattered gap. Valette was wounded in the leg but refused to leave. The breach held, sealed by Ottoman dead. Singlia faced simultaneous attacks by sea and land. Mustafa launched a cunning amphibious assault using captured Maltese boats. But Valette had anticipated it. Hidden sea-level batteries, the post of Aragon, erupted, shredding the boats. Knights swam out to sink survivors. The assault drowned in chaos. August became a furnace of attrition. Ottoman morale plummeted. Food spoiled, water was brackish, disease raged. The knights, though starving and exhausted, clung to their faith and Valette's iron leadership. Mustafa, desperate, offered Valette safe passage for surrender. The Grand Master's reply was legendary: "I will send you only powder and shot." He fired cannon loaded with the heads of captured janissaries into the Ottoman camp. A grim warning: Malta would be their grave. Rumors flickered of relief, a Spanish-Italian force mustering in Sicily. But could they arrive in time? On September 7th, the Ottomans launched their final, all-out assault. Every reserve was thrown against Singlia and Burgu. The fighting reached apocalyptic levels. Walls became rubble slopes. Knights fought like cornered lions, their swords dulled, armor dented. Civilians threw the last stones from crumbling rooftops. Just as Burgu's defenses seemed ready to collapse, a sentry on Dina's walls saw sails. Not a few ships, an armada. "Soccorso! Soccorso!" The cry echoed across the blood-soaked peninsula. The Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, had arrived with 8,000 men. The effect was electric. Ottoman assaults faltered. Defenders found new strength, screaming, "Relief! Relief!" Mustafa, realizing the tide had turned, ordered a desperate attack on the relief force landing at St. Paul's Bay. It failed. With Christian troops now pouring onto the island and his own army decimated, diseased, and demoralized, the Ottoman commander faced annihilation. On September 11th, under cover of darkness, the once mighty Ottoman fleet began its ignominious retreat. They abandoned siege guns, wounded, and mountains of supplies. Dawn revealed an empty sea and a silent, corpse-strewn landscape. Malta stood. The impossible had happened. The Great Siege was over. The cost was horrific. Barely 600 knights remained fit to fight. Thousands of Maltese lay dead. But the Ottomans had lost over 25,000 men, an elite army shattered. Valette, the indomitable shield, lived to see his victory. He founded Valletta, a new fortress city, on the ashes. The siege of Malta resonated across Europe. Christendom rejoiced. The seemingly unstoppable Ottoman tide had been decisively broken, not by vast armies, but by the unbreakable will of a few hundred knights and a people defending their home and faith unto death. The Knights Hospitaller had proven they were more than relics. They were the enduring, bloody bulwark against the East. The shield of Christendom, though battered and scarred, held fast beneath the Maltese sun. Story number 9. The Battle of Tours, 732. The Hammer Strikes. October 732. A chill wind whipped across the thick, rain-sodden loam of central Gaul. An army unlike any seen before in Western Europe stood poised to shatter Christendom. From the scorching deserts of Al-Andalus, fueled by decades of conquest, surged the Umayyad Caliphate's force. Led by the formidable governor Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, a seasoned warrior prince, it numbered perhaps 20,000, lightning-fast Berber cavalry, disciplined Syrian infantry, and Arab horsemen clad in glittering mail. They had crossed the Pyrenees like a tempest, ravaging Aquitaine, burning Bordeaux, sacking the shrine of Saint Martin at Tours. Their goal? The rich monasteries of the Loire, then Paris, then the heart of Francia. Islam seemed destined to wash over Europe. Panic spread faster than their horses. The Frankish realm faced annihilation. Standing in their path, near the strategic crossroads between Tours and Poitiers, was Charles, mayor of the Palace of Austrasia. Not yet king, but the de facto ruler, a man of iron will forged in brutal civil wars. He rallied the Frankish host, grim, heavily armored infantry drawn from across the northern kingdoms. Perhaps 15,000 strong, they were a stark contrast to the Umayyad host. Fewer horses, reliant on solid ranks and sheer physical power. Charles's men were veterans, wielding heavy axes, long swords, and spears, their signature weapon the deadly Francisca throwing axe. They formed a vast, dense phalanx, anchored on high ground amidst dense forests, their flanks protected by woods and streams. This was not a raid, it was a shield wall for the future of Europe. Charles earned his name that week, Martel, the Hammer. For 6 days, tension crackled. Abd al-Rahman, confident after crushing Duke Odo of Aquitaine days before, probed the Frankish lines. Skirmishes erupted. Light cavalry dashed forward, loosing arrows, testing the shield wall. The Franks held, disciplined, unmoving, their line a wall of wood, iron, and resolve. Charles knew his strength, defense. He would let the storm break upon his anvil. Abd al-Rahman, seeing the Franks' refuse to engage on open ground, grew impatient. Autumn deepened, supplies dwindled, plunder beckoned beyond. He needed a decisive victory. On the 7th day, likely October 10th, the order came. The Umayyad cavalry, the core of their power, prepared for the hammer blow. The attack began with terrifying momentum. Thousands of horsemen, a swirling tide of color and steel, spurred their agile mounts across the open ground. Their war cries, Allahu Akbar, mingled with the thunder of hooves, aiming to shatter the Frankish center. Arrows darkened the sky, rattling off shields. Then came the impact. A roar like colliding worlds erupted as Berber and Arab lancers slammed into the Frankish shield wall. But the Frankish ranks, braced deep, their shields overlapping like scales, held firm. Axes rose and fell with brutal efficiency, hacking at horses and riders. Spears thrust forward, impaling the charging cavalry. The dense forest on the flanks prevented envelopment. The initial fury of the charge dissipated against the immovable Frankish rock. Horses screamed, riders fell, the momentum stalled in a chaotic press of bodies and steel. Abd al-Rahman, witnessing his elite cavalry flounder, committed his reserves. More waves crashed against the shield wall. The fighting descended into brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Frankish warriors, fighting shoulder to shoulder, used their weight and heavy weapons to devastating effect. The Umayyad infantry struggled to support their cavalry in the press. Hours passed. The Frankish line bent, strained, but did not break. Charles, fighting in the front ranks like his men, was a pillar of strength, rallying any point that wavered. The ground became a quagmire of mud, blood, and fallen men and beasts. The air choked with the screams of the wounded, the clash of metal, the stench of death and fear. Then a pivotal moment. Frankish scouts, likely aided by surviving Aquitanian remnants under Odo, discovered the Umayyad camp, poorly guarded, filled with the immense plunder of their campaign. Seizing the opportunity, a Frankish detachment surged towards it. The cry went up from the Muslim ranks, "The camp! The plunder!" Panic, swift and devastating, ripped through the Umayyad forces. For warriors driven by conquest and booty, the The thought of losing their treasure was catastrophic. Discipline evaporated. Men began turning, desperate to save their riches. Abd al-Rahman, attempting to stem the rout, was isolated, surrounded, and cut down fighting fiercely. His death sealed the fate of the battle. Seeing their leader fall and their camp threatened, the Umayyad army dissolved. What began as a retreat became a headlong flight. The formidable cavalry, moments ago the terror of Gaul, now fled southwards in disarray, abandoning their wounded, their equipment, and mountains of loot. The Frankish infantry, exhausted but exultant, pursued cautiously, cutting down stragglers but wary of the still potent enemy cavalry. As dusk fell, the field near Tours and Poitiers belonged to Charles Martel. The Frankish shield wall had held. The seemingly unstoppable wave of Islamic expansion from Iberia had crashed against the anvil of Francia and shattered. The aftermath was profound. Charles did not pursue deep into Aquitaine, consolidating his power north instead. But the strategic victory was absolute. The Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, reverberated across the known world. In Damascus, the Caliph learned of a distant defeat. In Rome, Christendom breathed a sigh of deliverance. Charles Martel became the savior of the West, his prestige soaring, paving the way for his descendants, the Carolingians, to forge an empire under Charlemagne. The battle marked the high water mark of the Umayyad Caliphate's expansion into Western Europe. While raids continued, the dream of a permanent Islamic conquest north of the Pyrenees died on that muddy field. The cultural and religious map of Europe was decisively shaped. It was more than a battle. It was the day the hammer of the Franks struck a blow that echoed through centuries, ensuring the continent we know would emerge from the crucible of the Dark Ages. The fate of a continent, decided by the strength of a shield wall and the resolve of a man called Martel. Story number 10. The Siege of Constantinople, 1200 for the Crusader betrayal. Voiceover, dark, betrayal-laden, building to apocalyptic fury. April 1204. Constantinople. Not a city, but a universe of gold, marble, and ancient faith, the heart of Christendom's other lung. But now, a sickness festered within its mighty Theodosian walls. The Fourth Crusade, diverted by Venetian greed and Byzantine intrigue, stood encamped outside the greatest city on earth. Not facing Saracens, but fellow Christians. Pope Innocent III raged, excommunicating the host, but his words were lost in the wind of ambition. Doge Enrico Dandolo, the blind, ancient Venetian lion, saw not salvation, but plunder. Alexios IV, the puppet prince they'd installed months before, was dead, murdered by his own people who rejected Western demands. Now, Emperor Alexios V. Doukas, the grim Mortsufflos, defied them. The Crusaders, stranded, debt-ridden, saw only one path to riches and passage: sack the city they came to save. Holy war became sacrilege. The stage was set for horror. Constantinople's legendary defenses were formidable: triple land walls, sea chains guarding the Golden Horn. But the city was weakened. Decades of decay, civil strife, and the Crusaders' previous presence had eroded unity. Alexios V rallied defenders, Varangian guard axes, Byzantine spearmen, citizens, but morale was brittle. Facing them, 20,000 hardened Crusaders, Frankish knights, Venetian marines, Flemish infantry, led by Boniface of Montferrat and Dandolo. Their desperation matched their fury. On April 9th, the assault began. Venetian galleys, siege towers lashed to their masts, surged towards the sea walls along the Golden Horn. A storm of Greek fire rained down, turning the water into liquid hell. Ships burned, men screamed, but the Crusaders pressed on. Knights leapt onto ramparts, fighting desperately against Varangian axes. It was brutal, costly, repelled. The defenders held. Hope flickered in Byzantium. Failure bred resolve. On April 12th, a treacherous north wind blew. Dandolo seized fate. Venetian ships, sails straining, rammed the sea walls near the Blacherni Palace with renewed ferocity. Crossbow bolts darkened the sky. Sappers ashore battered the ancient land walls near the same sector. This time, fortune favored the invaders. A fire, perhaps set by Crusader incendiaries, erupted near the Petria Gate on the sea wall, consuming defenses. Amidst the smoke and chaos, a handful of knights, led by the Frenchman André Dierbois, clawed their way onto a tower near the Blacherny. They held. More followed. Simultaneously, a land assault breached a weakened section nearby. Panic, swift and lethal, ripped through the Byzantine ranks. Alexios V fought valiantly, leading countercharges, but the tide had turned. The Lion of St. Mark flew from the captured tower. Constantinople's first line had fallen. The city bled. The nightmare began at dawn, April 13th. Crusaders poured through the Blacherny breaches like a flood of steel, and righteous fury twisted into greed. The Varangians made a last, doomed stand at the Milion monument, axes cleaving, dying where they stood. Emperor Alexios V fled the city, abandoning his people to their fate. What followed was not battle, but desecration. For 3 days, the Crusade of Christ became a carnival of carnage. Knights, sworn to protect the Holy Sepulchre, ran amok through Hagia Sophia. They hacked the silver altar to pieces. A prostitute danced on the patriarch's throne. Relics were torn from shrines, chalices used for wine. Libraries, repositories of ancient wisdom, burned. Palaces were stripped bare. Women, nuns, children, no sanctuary was sacred. The streets ran red, not just with blood, but with the spilled wine of stolen excess. The Venetians methodically looted art, horses, bronze, the 4 ancient horses above the hippodrome taken as trophies for San Marco. The Franks grabbed gold, jewels, silks. Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, became a screaming abattoir. The scale of plunder was unimaginable. Priceless icons, manuscripts, relics scattered across Europe, lost forever. The accumulated treasure of 9 centuries fueled Western churches and noble houses. The Byzantine Empire was shattered. A puppet Latin empire was carved from its corpse, while Byzantine rump states clung to life in Nicaea, Trebizond, Epirus. The great schism between East and West deepened into an unbridgeable chasm of hatred. Venice ascended to maritime supremacy, fattened on the carcass. Pope Innocent, initially horrified, later justified the atrocity as God's judgment on schismatic Greeks. The Crusade's original goal, Jerusalem, was forgotten in the intoxication of stolen gold. The siege of 1204 wasn't a conquest, it was a psychic wound on Christendom. It shattered Byzantine power, leaving it vulnerable to the Ottoman rise centuries later. It exposed the brutal hypocrisy beneath the crusading ideal. The sack of Constantinople stands as a grim testament to the corrupting power of greed and the fragility of civilization before the sword. The echoes of breaking marble and dying pleas in Hagia Sophia resonate through history, a chilling reminder of the day Christian knights drowned the Queen of Cities in blood and fire, all for a share of her glittering corpse. The Fourth Crusade achieved immortality, not in liberation, but in infamy. The light of the East dimmed, and darkness gathered where the walls were breached. Story number 11, The Battle of Grunwald, 1410, the breaking of the Iron Brotherhood. July 15, 1410. Dawn broke stifling and ominous over the fields between Grunwald and Tannenberg. The air hung thick, humid, pregnant with the promise of slaughter. 2 vast hosts faced each other across the rolling Prussian plain, the culmination of 2 centuries of bitter crusade, conquest, and resistance. On one side, the Teutonic Order, Europe's most formidable military machine. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen commanded near 20,000 hardened warriors, German and French knights encased in gleaming plate, mercenary crossbowmen from Switzerland and England, disciplined Prussian levies. Their black crosses promised holy war. They stood arrayed in deep, disciplined ranks, confident, arrogant. For generations, their iron fist had ruled the Baltic. Today, they expected another victory forged in faith and steel. Opposing them stood an unprecedented alliance, the united forces of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. King Władysław II Jagiello, the shrewd Lithuanian convert, commanded this colossal force, perhaps 30,000 strong. Beside him, his fiery cousin, Grand Duke Vytautas the Great. This was no mere army, it was a continent on the march. Polish heavy knights, seasoned in wars against the order. Lithuanian light cavalry, swift and fierce, hardened by generations battling Mongols. Fearsome Tatar horse archers, Bohemian mercenaries wielding deadly war wagons, Ruthenian spearmen, and even Moldavian allies. Their banners, the White Eagle of Poland, the Vitus of Lithuania, fluttered alongside saints and pagan symbols. Jagiello, deliberately cautious, had spent the night praying. Vytautas chafed for battle. Together, they represented a defiant challenge to the Order's dominion. The Teutons struck first. As the morning haze burned off, Jungingen, impatient and confident, sent heralds bearing 2 swords to the Polish-Lithuanian camp. A calculated insult. Use these, for you lack the courage to face us. The challenge was accepted. Jagiello ordered deliberate delay, holding his main Polish lines back, letting the sun climb, letting the heavily armored Teutonic knights bake in their steel ovens on the open field. Vytautas unleashed the Lithuanian and Tatar right wing. Like a storm cloud, they surged forward, a thunder of hooves, a hail of arrows. They crashed against the Teutonic left under Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrode. The impact was ferocious, but the Order's disciplined ranks held. Crossbow bolts sliced through lighter cavalry. German knights countercharged, their heavy lances devastating. Slowly, inevitably, the Lithuanian assault faltered. Then, whether by tactical design or genuine collapse, Vytautas's wing broke. They streamed back, seemingly routed, pursued triumphantly by Wallenrode's knights deep into the woods. The Teutonic left surged forward, abandoning its position, scenting total victory. It was a trap. Jagiello had held his powerful Polish center and right in reserve. As the disordered Teutonic left chased the feigned Lithuanian retreat into difficult terrain, Vytautas rallied his forces. Simultaneously, Jagiello unleashed his Polish knights. A steel-tipped avalanche slammed into the Teutonic center, commanded by Jungingen himself. The shock was cataclysmic. Knight met knight in a deafening cacophony of clanging steel, splintering lances, and war cries. Horses screamed, men fell, trampled in the churning mud. The battle dissolved into a swirling, chaotic maelstrom of individual combats across miles of field. The Teutonic discipline began to fray under the relentless Polish pressure. Jagiello remained a calm center, directing reserves from a nearby hill, his banner a rallying point. Meanwhile, the overextended Teutonic left found disaster. Emerging from the woods, expecting shattered foes, they were met by Vytautas's reformed Lithuanians, Tatars, and fresh Polish reserves. Ambushed and surrounded, Wallenrode's knights were cut down mercilessly. The tide was turning. Back in the center, Jungingen saw his left wing annihilated and his center buckling. Desperation took hold. He gathered his final reserve, 16 elite banner companies, the core of the Order's might. In a last, desperate gamble for victory or glorious death, the Grand Master himself led a thunderous charge straight towards Jagiello's command hill. It was a move of terrifying courage and folly. The Polish knights surrounding Jagiello met the charge head-on. The fighting around the royal banner reached apocalyptic intensity. Knights grappled hand-to-hand, daggers finding gaps in plate armor. Maces crushed helms. The air choked with dust, blood spray, and the screams of dying men and horses. Jungingen fought like a lion, but Polish knights swarmed him. He was dragged from his saddle and hacked to pieces. The sight of the Grand Master's banner falling shattered the Teutonic spirit. Panic erupted. The Master is dead. Flee! The cry spread like wildfire. The mighty Teutonic host dissolved. Knights threw down weapons, abandoning their wounded, their comrades, their pride. The rout became a massacre. Polish and Lithuanian cavalry pursued relentlessly for miles, cutting down the fleeing remnants. The marshes and streams ran red. By dusk, the field of Grunwald was a scene of unimaginable horror. Thousands lay dead, perhaps 8,000 Teutonic knights and soldiers, including almost their entire leadership. The cream of the Order's chivalry was extinguished. Polish and Lithuanian losses were heavy but bearable. Jagiello surveyed the carnage, the broken black crosses littering the field. The Teutonic Order's aura of invincibility was shattered. Their military power was broken. The Battle of Grunwald, or Tannenberg, was one of medieval Europe's largest and most decisive clashes. It broke the back of Teutonic expansionism, secured Polish-Lithuanian dominance in Eastern Europe for centuries, and marked the beginning of the end for the militant monastic state. The swords sent as an insult now lay buried in the blood-soaked earth, symbols not of Polish cowardice, but of the Iron Brotherhood's catastrophic pride. The thunder that rolled over the fields that day wasn't just the clash of arms, it was the sound of an empire falling. Story number 12, The Siege of Chateau Gallard, 1203 to 1204, the key to Normandy. Perched defiantly atop a sheer limestone cliff overlooking a deep loop of the River Seine, Chateau Gallard in 1203 wasn't just a castle, it was Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, the saucy castle, deemed utterly impregnable. Its concentric walls, cunningly designed bastions, and deadly choke points represented the pinnacle of 12th century military engineering. Now, it stood as the final, crucial bastion shielding English-ruled Normandy from the relentless ambition of France's King Philip Augustus. Its fall would unlock the entire duchy. Philip knew it. John of England, Richard's hapless brother, knew it. And the castle's grim constable, Roger de Lacy, knew his 300 knights and men-at-arms faced an impossible task against Philip's thousands. Philip arrived in August 1203. His engineers surveyed the fortress, a brutal puzzle of stone. Direct assault seemed suicidal. Instead, he initiated a classic siege, strangulation. His forces sealed the land approaches, built pontoon bridges to control the river, and blockaded supplies. Siege engines, massive trebuchets nicknamed Malvoisin, Bad Neighbor, and Capon, began their relentless, bone-shaking work. Day and night, giant stones arced through the sky, pounding the outer bailey walls. The thunderous impacts echoed for miles, a constant reminder of the pressure grinding against de Lacy's resolve. Within the castle, supplies dwindled. Winter approached, biting and harsh. Hope faded with the shortening days, but de Lacy, a hardened veteran, held firm. He expelled the non-combatants, women, children, the old, a brutal necessity that condemned them to starvation between the lines, a haunting testament to the siege's cruelty. Philip, frustrated by the slow progress and the castle's resilience, shifted tactics in the dead of winter. February 1204. The outer bailey, though battered, still held. Philip's engineers spotted a critical weakness, the rocky spur connecting the outer ward to the middle ward. Under cover of darkness and the ceaseless bombardment, miners began their treacherous work. Chipping away at the frozen rock, they dug deep galleries beneath the foundations. For days, the rhythmic chink-chink of picks was the sound of impending doom. Then, props were set ablaze. The timbers crackled, groaned, and collapsed. With a deafening roar that shook the very cliff, a massive section of the outer bailey wall tumbled into the ravine below. French knights, screaming their battle cries, poured through the smoking breach. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the shattered courtyard. De Lacy's men fought like demons, but overwhelmed, they were forced to retreat, blowing up the connecting bridge to the middle ward as they fell back. The outer defenses were Philip's. The middle ward, however, was a tougher nut. Its walls were thicker, its position even more formidable, accessed only by a narrow, heavily defended causeway. Philip's artillery redoubled its fury. Stones smashed against the formidable keep complex. Yet weeks passed. Spring rains turned the ground to mud, hindering assaults. De Lacy's defiance seemed unbreakable. Philip needed audacity. His scouts reported a near-impossible vulnerability, a small, unguarded window high on the chapel wall within the innermost ward. It was part of a latrine chute, the garderobe. Seemingly inaccessible, it was the castle's forgotten Achilles' heel. On the night of March 6, 1204, under the cloak of a diversionary attack on the main middle ward gates, a hand-picked band of French soldiers undertook a mission worthy of legend. Scaling the treacherous, rain-slicked cliff face beneath the chapel, they reached the base of the garderobe shaft. One by one, they squeezed into the narrow, fetid stone channel. Wriggling upwards through darkness and filth, they emerged, gasping and stinking, into the sacred space of the chapel itself, the heart of the inner sanctum. Finding it momentarily deserted, they raced to the inner ward's main gate. Their axes hacked at the heavy timber bar. The grinding sound of wood yielding echoed in the pre-dawn stillness. Outside, French troops, poised for the signal, heard it. They surged forward as the gates groaned open. Pandemonium erupted within the inner ward. Awakened English defenders scrambled from their quarters, met by French soldiers flooding through the breached gate and the chapel. The fighting was desperate, chaotic, confined within the castle's innermost walls. Roger de Lacy, realizing the unimaginable had happened, fought fiercely but was soon overwhelmed and captured. Resistance, though heroic, was futile. By dawn, the oriflamme, the sacred banner of France, flew from the highest tower of Richard's impregnable fortress. Chateau Gallard had fallen, not by storming its mighty walls head-on, but by a daring, almost surreal infiltration through its very bowels. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for England. Chateau Gallard was the linchpin of Normandy's defense. With its fall, the entire duchy lay exposed. Demoralized and leaderless, other Norman strongholds capitulated rapidly to Philip's advancing army. Rouen, Normandy's capital, surrendered within months. By the end of 1204, after nearly 3 centuries of rule, Normandy was irrevocably lost to the English crown. John's incompetence was laid bare. His nickname, Lackland, became bitterly a part. Philip Augustus achieved his lifelong ambition, consolidating France as a dominant power. The siege of Chateau Gallard was more than a military engagement. It was a masterclass in siegecraft, combining relentless pressure, engineering ingenuity, and breathtaking audacity. It marked the dramatic end of the Angevin Empire on the continent and a pivotal shift in the balance of power in medieval Europe. The saucy castle's defiance was broken, and with it, England's continental dreams crumbled, sealed by the stench of a garderobe and the relentless will of a French king. Story number 13, The Siege of Kenilworth, 1266, England's longest siege. Rain fell in sheets, turning the Warwickshire landscape into a churning sea of mud. June 1266. Kenilworth Castle. Not just a fortress, but a symbol of shattered rebellion and desperate last stands. The Second Barons' War had reached its grim climax. Here, the last die-hard supporters of the slain rebel Simon de Montfort, the disinherited, defied King Henry III and his vengeful son, Prince Edward. Led by the formidable Henry de Hastings, they held England's mightiest stronghold, a vast island fortress encircled by a colossal man-made lake, its walls thicker than nightmares, towers piercing the leaden sky. Inside, 1,200 souls, knights, men-at-arms, desperate families, prepared to fight for their lost cause, their lands, their very lives. Outside, the royal host, commanded by Prince Edward himself, settled in for a siege that would test medieval England like never before. Kenilworth wasn't just strong, it was a hydrological nightmare for attackers. The Great Mere, fed by cunningly diverted streams, formed a shimmering, impassable moat nearly a mile wide. Causeways were narrow death traps covered by murderous arrow loops. The concentric stone walls, built by de Montfort's father, were virtually impervious to contemporary siege engines. Hastings knew his castle. He'd stockpiled vast quantities of food, weapons, and, crucially, fresh water from deep wells. Morale, fueled by bitter defiance against the king who'd stripped them of everything, ran high. Prince Edward, fresh from crushing de Montfort at Evesham, faced not just stone and water, but the unbreakable will of the dispossessed. He had the might of the realm, but Kenilworth mocked conventional assault. Edward's siege began methodically. His engineers built pontoon bridges and siege forts to isolate the castle. Massive trebuchets, Edward's hammer, and the terrifying war wolf were painstakingly assembled. Their first stones, flung with earth-shaking force, slammed against Kenilworth's outer curtain wall. The sound echoed for miles, a grim drumbeat of royal intent. But the walls, engineered to absorb punishment, held. Archers dueled across the water, arrows hissing like deadly rain. Royal attempts to storm the causeways were bloodily repulsed, bodies piling in the mud. Summer dragged on. The rain didn't stop. The Great Mere seemed eternal. Disease, dysentery, and fever, began to stalk the royal camp, fostered by the damp and filth. Inside Kenilworth, Hastings taunted the besiegers, launching sudden sorties in small boats, burning siege works, disappearing back into the watery maze. Hope flickered within the walls. Frustration mounted in the royal ranks. Edward, renowned for his strategic brilliance, knew attrition was key, but time favored the well-supplied defenders. Enter the papal legate Ottabuono de Fieschi. Wielding the ultimate weapon, excommunication, he arrived to break the defenders' spirit. From a specially built platform, his voice booming across the water, he pronounced anathema on Hastings and his men. They were cast out of the church, denied salvation, their souls forfeit. Hastings' response was legendary defiance. Archers atop the keep fired arrows wrapped with derisive messages. "We fear your curses less than Edward's engines. Our souls are our own." The spiritual siege failed. Kenilworth remained defiant, physically and spiritually impregnable. Autumn brought deepening cold and Edward's grim resolve. He turned to engineering on an unprecedented scale. The key? Drain the Great Mere. A colossal undertaking began. Thousands of laborers, driven by royal command, dug vast drainage ditches, redirecting streams, constructing dams and sluices. Day and night, under constant arrow fire, they toiled. Slowly, agonizingly, the mighty lake began to shrink. Inch by muddy inch, the protective waters receded, revealing treacherous, sucking marshland. Edward's trebuchets, dragged closer to the newly exposed northern walls, intensified their bombardment. Stones the size of oxen smashed into the ancient masonry. Cracks appeared. Dust rained down on the defenders. The island fortress was becoming a peninsula. By November, the Great Mere was a shadow of itself. Vast mudflats, churned by rain and boots, stretched towards the walls. Edward launched his masterstroke. Under cover of darkness and a relentless barrage, royal engineers constructed a massive, mobile siege tower, the Bear, on the drained bed. Protected by wet hides against fire, crammed with knights, it lumbered towards the damaged St. George's Tower. Simultaneously, miners clawed at the foundations beneath the relentless pounding. On December 13th, after 172 days of siege, the final assault began. The Bear crashed against the tower. Sappers ignited their mine. With a thunderous roar, a section of the mighty wall collapsed. Royal knights, led by Edward himself, surged through the breach and the mined gap into the outer ward. What followed was not swift victory, but brutal, house-to-house carnage within the castle's vast precincts. The disinherited, cornered and with nothing left to lose, fought like furies. They barricaded streets, turned stables into strongpoints, rained tiles and boiling water from rooftops. Every courtyard, every building became a killing ground. Edward's troops, bogged down in the mud and ferocious resistance, paid for every inch in blood. The fighting raged for days, a microcosm of the wider war's savagery. Slowly, remorselessly, the royal forces pushed the defenders back towards the towering inner keep. Starvation and relentless pressure finally told. On December 20th, Henry de Hastings, recognizing the futility of further bloodshed, offered surrender. Edward, weary of the slaughter and facing a restless nobility, accepted. Terms were harsh but allowed the defenders to walk free, stripped of everything but their lives. Kenilworth fell. The longest siege in English medieval history was over. The disinherited were broken. Henry III's authority was brutally reasserted. Edward had proven his ruthless capability, but at immense cost. The castle itself, though damaged, stood as a scarred testament to its defenders' incredible resilience. The siege became legend, a story of engineering audacity against nature, of spiritual defiance against papal might, and of a lost cause held with breathtaking tenacity against the full power of the crown. Kenilworth taught England that even the strongest walls could be overcome by relentless will and ingenuity, but that the price of defiance and of crushing it was written deep in mud, stone, and blood. The echoes of defiance faded, leaving only the rain and the broken mere, where water met fire and England's will was tested to its limits. Story number 14. The Siege of Antioch. 1097 to 1098 Trial by Fire and Faith. October 1097. Before the towering ancient walls of Antioch, the flower of the First Crusade withered. What began as a fervent pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem had descended into a nightmare of starvation, betrayal, and gnawing despair. Prince Bohemond of Taranto, Count Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Europe's proudest knights, now commanded a skeletal host, ravaged by disease and famine, camped amidst the mud and ruins outside one of the Near East's mightiest cities. Antioch's walls, built by Justinian centuries before, stretched for miles over hills and ravines, studded with 400 towers. Held by the formidable Seljuk Turk, Yagi Sayan, it seemed impregnable. The Crusaders' dream was dying on the slopes of Mount Silpius. Winter brought relentless rain, turning the Orontes river plain into a quagmire. Food vanished. Horses died, becoming meager stew. Men gnawed on leather, roots, even the corpses of fallen Turks. Morale plummeted. Desertions began, knights slipping away into the Syrian night. Priests preached of divine punishment, urging penance. Yet, the leaders held a fragile, desperate unity. Bohemond, ever the ambitious strategist, saw opportunity in despair. He whispered of a plan, a betrayal from within. An Armenian guard captain, Firas, disillusioned with Yagi Sayan, might open a gate. But Bohemond demanded a price. Lordship of Antioch, should it fall. The other princes, cornered by catastrophe, reluctantly agreed. Hope, fragile as an ember, flickered. Meanwhile, Yagi Sayan mocked them from his citadel. His garrison, well supplied, rained arrows and insults. Turkish sorties struck like vipers, inflicting bloody losses. The Crusaders huddled in their makeshift camps, La Mahamari, Malregard, enduring constant harassment. Disease stalked them, typhoid, scurvy. The stench of death hung thick. Yet they built siege engines, creaking towers, mangonels, hurling stones with dwindling force against the immovable walls. The siege became a grim test of endurance, a crucible forging fanaticism from suffering. Visions were reported, Saints George and Demetrius urging them on. Peter Bartholomew, a peasant mystic, spoke of a holy relic hidden within Antioch itself, the lance that pierced Christ's side. Desperate men clung to miracles. Bohemond's conspiracy simmered. Secret messages passed to Firas. The plan: a night assault on the Tower of the Two Sisters, guarded by Firas. On the storm-lashed night of June 2, 1098, the moment came. Crusader forces feinted attacks elsewhere. Under cover of darkness and torrential rain, a small band led by Bohemond crept towards the designated tower. A rope ladder was thrown. Hearts pounded. Would Firas betray them? A light flickered from the tower. The ladder was secured. Bohemond scaled first, followed by his fiercest knights. They overwhelmed the startled guards. Firas held true. The gate groaned open. Chaos erupted. Crusaders poured through the open postern gate like a dam burst. Deus Vult! Deus Vult! The cry echoed through the sleeping city streets. Turks, roused from slumber, fought desperately in the alleys, from rooftops. It was brutal, confused slaughter in the dark. Yagi Sayan, hearing the tumult, fled in panic through another gate, only to fall from his horse and be beheaded by local Christians. By dawn, Antioch was in Crusader hands, but not its towering citadel, still defiantly held by Yagi Sayan's son, Shams ad-Dawla. The Crusaders found themselves trapped inside the city they had besieged, their meager forces scattered, low on supplies and vulnerable. Disaster struck within days. News arrived like a thunderclap. Kerboga, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, approached with a vast relief army, perhaps 40,000 strong. He came not just to relieve Antioch, but to annihilate the Crusaders utterly. Panic seized the exhausted victors. Trapped between the impregnable citadel and Kerboga's host, starvation loomed again. Despair returned, deeper than before. Some knights proposed abandoning the city, fleeing towards the coast. Others prepared to sell their lives dearly. Then, Peter Bartholomew stepped forward again. Guided by visions, he led priests and nobles to dig in the floor of Antioch's Cathedral of St. Peter. On June 14th, amidst crumbling masonry and held breath, they unearthed a rusted spear point. The Holy Lance. A collective frenzy erupted. God had sent them a sign. Their faith was vindicated. Raymond of Toulouse embraced the relic. Morale soared from the abyss to ecstatic fervor. The discovery transformed the army. Fasting and penance gave way to fervent prayers and battle hymns. Adhemer of Le Puy, the papal legate, organized a great procession through the city, the lance carried aloft. They challenged Kerboga to battle. On June 28th, the starving, emaciated crusaders marched out of the gates they had fought so hard to enter. They formed ragged lines on the plain before the bridge gate. Against them stretched Kerboga's vast host, Turkish horse archers, Arab infantry, Kurdish cavalry. It seemed suicidal. The battle opened with Turkish arrows darkening the sky. The Crusader infantry, anchored by the relic's presence, held their shield wall with desperate faith. Bohemond, commanding the reserve, watched for weakness. Kerboga fatally hesitated, trying to negotiate rather than crush them immediately. Then, the Crusader counterstroke. A sudden, massed charge by the entire army, driven by religious ecstasy and nothing left to lose. Knights crashed into the Turkish lines before Kerboga could fully deploy. The shock was immense. Rumors spread like wildfire among Kerboga's diverse army, treachery, Crusader reinforcements, panic born of the Crusaders' terrifying, gaunt resolve and the mystique of the lance, ripped through the Muslim ranks. The mighty host fractured. Kerboga fled. His army dissolved into a chaotic rout, pursued by vengeful, starving Franks who fell upon the abandoned camp, gorging on food and plunder. The victory was miraculous. Antioch was secured. The citadel surrendered. The First Crusade, seemingly doomed twice over, first outside the walls, then trapped within, had snatched triumph from the jaws of annihilation. The Holy Lance became its most potent symbol, though later disputed. The Siege of Antioch became legend, a saga of impossible endurance, cynical betrayal redeemed by desperate courage, starvation, divine visions, and a victory forged in the crucible of fanatical faith. It proved the Crusaders could overcome not just walls, but despair itself. The road to Jerusalem, though still long and bloody, lay open. They had passed through the fire and emerged, scarred but burning brighter, ready to claim their holy prize. The echo of Deus Vult now carried the weight of proven destiny. Story number 15, The Battle of Sluis, 1340 C of blood and broken timbers. Dawn, June 24, 1340. The Zwin estuary off Sluis churned, not with tide, but with the might of two kingdoms poised for slaughter. Edward III of England, young, furious, his claim to France denied, faced annihilation or apotheosis. Blockading the Flemish coast lay the colossal French fleet, nearly 200 vessels, a forest of masts under Admirals Quiret, Behuchet, and the Genoese mercenary Barbavera. Galleys bristling with crossbows, towering cogs chained together into floating castles, packed with knights and men-at-arms. King Philip VI boasted his ships would be Edward's prison or his tomb. Edward, aboard the cog Thomas, commanded perhaps 150 ships, leaner, lower, crewed by English archers and mariners forged in Channel storms. He had no choice. To relieve his Flemish allies and strike France, he must break the chain, or drown trying. Edward saw their formation, a crescent moon of death blocking the estuary mouth, ships lashed together, creating a near-impenetrable wall. The French held the weather gauge, the wind at their backs. Arrogance radiated from their decks. Behuchet, a former tax collector turned admiral, reportedly boasted they'd drag Edward to Paris in chains. Edward, the warrior king, chose audacity. He ordered his fleet into 3 lines, against the wind and tide, maneuvering perilously close. His secret weapon wasn't hidden below decks. It stood on them, thousands of English and Welsh longbowmen, their yew staves waiting to unleash hell. "Stand fast," Edward commanded, "for St. George in England. Today we reclaim the sea." As the English closed, the air erupted. French crossbowmen and Genoese mercenaries loosed first. A dark cloud of bolts hissed across the water, thudding into hulls, sails, and flesh. Men screamed, crumpled. Edward's ships held course, crashing into the French line with splintering force. Grappling hooks flew, biting into French timber. The battle descended into 100 nightmarish duels across the heaving decks. This wasn't naval maneuver, it was a floating infantry battle, a claustrophobic brawl on shifting wood. Knights in plate armor, cumbersome on unstable decks, clashed with English men-at-arms wielding axes and swords. The din was infernal, the twang of bowstrings, the crack of breaking wood, the guttural roars of combat, the shrieks of the dying, the groan of timbers under strain. Here, Edward's gamble paid. While French knights struggled for footing, English longbowmen, stationed high in the forecastles and crow's nests of their cogs, found their range. Volley after disciplined volley arced down into the packed French decks. At close range, their heavy arrows punched through mail, found gaps in plate, scythed down crossbowmen before they could reload. The sky darkened not with bolts, but with English shafts. French casualties mounted horrifically. The chained ships became a death trap. Retreat was impossible, reinforcement difficult. Panic began to ripple through the French ranks as decks grew slick with blood and men stumbled over fallen comrades. The turning point came mid-afternoon. Edward, spotting the French flagship Christopher, captured from the English earlier, led a ferocious boarding action. The Thomas rammed the great cog. English knights, led by the king himself, swords flashing, stormed onto its deck. A brutal melee ensued. Quayret fell, hacked down. The Christopher was retaken, its English flag raised anew. The sight sent a surge through the English fleet and despair through the French. Simultaneously, Barbavera's Genoese galleys, seeing the carnage unfolding amongst the cogs, tried to maneuver, not to aid the French center, but to flee. Their attempt caused chaos, colliding with French vessels already locked in combat. The Hutchet fought on grimly aboard his flagship, the Saint Jacques, but the tide was irreversible. English archers rained death on his decks. Boarders swarmed from multiple ships. As the Saint Jacques was overwhelmed, the Hutchet was captured. Legend claims Edward offered no quarter to the man who vowed to capture him. The Hutchet was hanged from his own mast, a grim pendulum swinging above the carnage. His death shattered the last French resistance. The tightly packed French formation became a slaughter pen. Ships, unable to maneuver, were boarded one after another. Some French crews jumped overboard, drowning under the weight of their armor. Others fought to the last, cut down on blood-drenched decks. By dusk, the Zwin estuary was a scene of apocalyptic horror. The water, thick as stew, was choked with wreckage, corpses, and thrashing men. Over 160 French ships were captured or sunk. French casualties were catastrophic. Estimates range from 16,000 to 18,000 dead, including most of their nobility at sea. The sea ran red for miles. English losses, though heavy, were a fraction of that. Edward's fleet, battered but victorious, anchored amidst the floating ruins of French sea power. The king, reportedly wounded in the thigh, surveyed the carnage, a grisly testament to his victory. When told of the vast number of French dead in the water, Edward is said to have remarked darkly, "I am sure the fish of the sea will speak French, for they have eaten so many." The Battle of Sluis was a cataclysm. It annihilated French naval power for a generation, securing English control of the Channel for decades to come. Edward landed unopposed in Flanders, invigorated his alliances, and plunged deeper into the conflict that would become the 100 Years' War. Sluis proved the devastating power of the English longbowmen, even at sea, and Edward III's ruthless brilliance. It wasn't just a victory, it was the brutal birth of English naval dominance, written in blood and broken timbers on a Flemish tide. The echoes of clashing steel and the cries of drowning men faded, but the message rang clear: the Lion of England ruled the waves. The sea had chosen its master, and France would bear the scars for a century. Story number 16, The Siege of Belgrade, 1456. The hammer of the East meets the shield of Christ. July 1456. The air over Belgrade hung thick, suffocating, charged with the promise of annihilation. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, stood at the zenith of his power. His colossal Ottoman host, over 100,000 strong, seasoned by victory, backed by the thunder of 300 cannons, choked the plains before the Danube fortress. This was no mere city, it was the last bulwark shielding Hungary, and beyond it, Christendom's vulnerable heart. If Belgrade fell, the road to Buda, Vienna, and Rome lay open. Panic rippled across Europe. Pope Calixtus III ordered church bells rung daily at noon, a desperate plea for divine intervention. Within Belgrade's scarred walls, a pitiful garrison awaited doom. But two men stood ready to defy the inevitable, the aging Hungarian warlord, János Hunyadi, and the fiery Franciscan friar, Giovanni da Capistrano, preaching a crusade to the desperate. Mehmed arrived in early July, his confidence absolute. Belgrade's position was strong, guarding the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, but its medieval walls were outdated, still bearing the scars of previous sieges. The Sultan unleashed his artillery. Day and night, the earth trembled as massive stone shot pounded the ancient fortifications. Towers crumbled. Dust clouds choked the defenders. Ottoman engineers, masters of their craft, dug siege trenches ever closer, shielded by earthworks and relentless arrow fire. Mehmed's fleet, hundreds of vessels strong, blockaded the rivers, strangling supply lines. Inside, Hunyadi, a veteran of countless battles against the Turk, directed a frantic defense. Civilians, men, women, children, labored day and night, shoring up breaches with timber, earth, and their own bodies. Hope was a fragile reed bending under an iron storm. Then, Capistrano arrived. Not with knights, but with a ragtag, burning host. Answering his fervent call, peasants, farmers, students, monks, and minor nobles, armed with scythes, flails, clubs, and crucifixes, streamed towards Belgrade. Dubbed the Crusaders of the Poor, they numbered perhaps 25,000, driven by faith, not discipline. Hunyadi, the pragmatist, was aghast at the logistical nightmare, but Capistrano's zeal was infectious. These fanatics, camped outside the city walls on the Sava's far bank, became an unexpected thorn in Mehmed's side. Their constant skirmishes harassed Ottoman foragers, their fervent prayers echoing across the water unnerved the besiegers. Mehmed contemptuously called them a rabble, but their presence complicated his siege. Hunyadi executed a masterstroke. Under cover of darkness on July 14th, he led a daring river assault. Breaking through the Ottoman naval blockade with fire ships and determined galleys, he shattered the chain across the Sava and fought his way into Belgrade with vital reinforcements, supplies, and his seasoned veterans. The garrison's spirit soared. Now, the city held Hunyadi's hardened core and Capistrano's unpredictable zealots. Mehmed, enraged by this defiance and the disruption to his blockade, intensified the bombardment. Breaches widened in the walls near the Danube and the Sabo Gate. On July 21st, after a massive cannonade, the Ottoman host surged forward in a colossal, coordinated assault. Thousands of elite janissaries and Anatolian infantry stormed the shattered ramparts. The battle reached apocalyptic levels. The defenders fought with the desperation of the damned. Hunyadi's veterans met the janissaries steel on steel in the breaches, axes cleaving, pikes thrusting. Boiling oil and water cascaded onto attackers. Capistrano, crucifix held high, raced along the walls, rallying his peasants wherever the line faltered. "Jesus! Jesus! Mary, help us!" they screamed, hurling themselves at the Turks with primal fury, fighting with rocks, knives, bare hands. The carnage was unspeakable. Ottoman bodies piled high before the breaches, but fresh waves kept coming. The sheer weight of numbers began to tell. Ottoman flags appeared on sections of the outer wall. Panic threatened to engulf the defenders. Just as collapse seemed imminent, Hunyadi ordered barrels of gunpowder and flaming pitch rolled into the massed attackers packed in the breaches below. The resulting explosions were cataclysmic, engulfing hundreds in fire and shrapnel, momentarily halting the Ottoman tide and buying precious time. The next day, July 22nd, dawned with Belgrade grievously wounded but still defiant. Mehmed prepared his final, crushing blow. His cannons concentrated fire on the most critical breaches. Then Capistrano, perhaps inspired, perhaps reckless, acted. Seeing Ottoman troops regrouping and momentarily demoralized below the walls near the Crusader camp, he seized the moment. Snatching up a banner, he reportedly cried, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the finish," and charged out of the relative safety of the Crusader camp towards the stunned Turks. His fanatical followers, seeing their saintly leader advance, surged after him in a screaming, disorganized tidal wave of faith and fury. Capistrano! Capistrano! Deus vult! It was madness. It was genius. The sudden, unexpected counterattack by thousands of screaming peasants caught the elite Ottoman troops completely off guard. Hunyadi, witnessing the chaos erupting in the Ottoman rear near their camp, instantly recognized the opportunity. He ordered the Belgrade garrison gates flung open. His disciplined veterans, horns blaring, charged out in a coordinated sally, smashing into the Ottoman flanks already reeling from Capistrano's fanatical assault. The effect was devastating. Panic, swift and contagious, ripped through the Ottoman ranks. Discipline evaporated. The cry, "The fortress is sallying! The rabble is upon us!" spread like wildfire. Mehmed, witnessing his elite troops breaking and fleeing before peasants and a desperate sortie, was stunned. His attempts to rally failed. The mighty Ottoman army dissolved into a chaotic, headlong rout. The Sultan himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his magnificent tent, his treasure, and his cannons. The victory was miraculous. Belgrade stood. The Ottoman superweapon, Mehmed the Conqueror, had been decisively defeated. Tens of thousands of Ottomans lay dead, their siege train captured. Hunyadi's reputation soared to legendary heights. Capistrano's rabble became heroes. The news electrified Christendom, shattering the myth of Ottoman invincibility born at Constantinople. Pope Calixtus III, attributing the victory to the power of prayer and the bells, decreed the noon bell ringing should continue forever, the origin of the Angelus prayer. While Mehmed would return, Belgrade remained a formidable barrier for decades. The siege of 1456 became a potent symbol, the triumph of desperate faith and determined courage over seemingly insurmountable odds. It proved that even the conqueror's hammer could be turned aside by the unyielding shield of Christ, held aloft by a warlord and a friar, and the fervent cry of "Deus vult," echoing over the blood-soaked banks of the Danube. The bells had rung, and the East had been answered, not with silence, but with the roar of deliverance. Story number 17, The Battle of Nicopolis, 1396, The Last Crusade's Agony. September 25, 1396. The Danube's banks near Nicopolis simmered under an uneasy sun. Before the Ottoman fortress, the flower of Western chivalry stood poised for glory or oblivion. The Last Crusade, a vast, glittering host summoned by Sigismund of Hungary to halt Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt's relentless advance into Europe. French knights, led by the impetuous Jean de Vienne and Count Jean de Nevers, heir to Burgundy, German princes, Hungarian nobles, Teutonic knights, even English volunteers. 15,000 armored warriors, the elite of Christendom, fueled by arrogance and holy zeal. Opposing them, Bayezid's seasoned Ottoman army, perhaps 20,000 strong, disciplined janissaries, fierce Anatolian infantry, Serbian vassal cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic, and the terrifying Sipahi horsemen. Two worlds collided. Europe's pride faced the thunderbolt storm. Sigismund, the cautious strategist, urged patience. Bayezid's forces held strong defensive positions atop steep hills near Nicopolis. Scouts reported hidden trenches and sharpened stakes protecting the Ottoman front. "Let the infantry soften them," Sigismund advised, "then our knights will deliver the blow." But the French knights, led by the brash Enguerrand de Coucy and Philippe d'Artois, scoffed. Chivalry demanded glory. "Let the infidels hide behind peasants," they declared. "Honor demands we charge. Are we to wait while Hungarians claim the victory?" Sigismund's authority crumbled before their fervor. The Crusades' unity fractured along lines of pride. The French demanded the vanguard. Reluctantly, Sigismund yielded. It was a fatal concession. The battle opened with catastrophic folly. Without reconnaissance, ignoring Sigismund's pleas, the French heavy cavalry lowered their lances. Trumpets blared. Thousands of armored knights and their mounted retinues spurred forward in a magnificent, thunderous charge up the slopes towards the Ottoman lines. They crashed into the waiting light infantry, Azaps and Akinci skirmishers. The impact was brutal but brief. The lightly armored Turks broke, fleeing up the hill. Elation surged through the French ranks. "See, they flee before us. On to the Sultan." They plunged deeper, disordered by the pursuit, horses tiring, blind to the trap. At the crest, they met the real Ottoman line. Not fleeing rabble, but a disciplined wall of janissaries standing firm behind trenches and stakes. Volleys of arrows and javelins darkened the sky. Horses screamed, impaled. Knights, unhorsed in the chaos, floundered in heavy plate. The charge dissolved into a tangled, chaotic melee against an unyielding wall. The French fought with desperate valor, but momentum was lost. Bayezid watched, then unleashed his reserves. Fresh Sipahi cavalry swept down from the flanks, encircling the embattled knights. Serbian heavy cavalry under Lazarevic, loyal vassals, slammed into their exposed rear. The trap snapped shut. Below, Sigismund watched in horror as the French vanguard vanished into the Ottoman killing ground. He committed his Hungarian and Transylvanian forces in a desperate bid to rescue them. They fought their way up the bloody slopes, engaging the Sipahi and Serbian wings. For a time, the battle raged fiercely across the hillside. But the heart of the Crusader army, its finest knights, was already being annihilated atop the hill. Isolated, exhausted, and overwhelmed, the French were cut down or captured en masse. Jean de Nevers was surrounded, his banner captured. Jean de Vienne fell, sword in hand. The flower of Burgundy and France was trampled in the mud. Seeing the vanguard destroyed and Sigismund's main force locked in brutal combat, panic seized the Crusader rear German infantry, Wallachian allies, and the baggage guard. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Mircea the Elder of Wallachia, seeing the tide turn and perhaps harboring old grievances against Sigismund, abandoned the field. His cavalry wheeled and fled. The cry of treason spread like wildfire. Sigismund's flank was exposed. His weary troops, demoralized by the French disaster and the Wallachian desertion, began to waver. Bayezid, sensing victory, committed his final reserves. The Ottoman pressure became irresistible. Sigismund's line buckled, then broke. The retreat became a rout, then a massacre. Crusaders fled towards the Danube, pursued relentlessly by Sipahi horsemen. Men drowned trying to swim the river, dragged down by armor. Others were cut down on the banks. Sigismund himself barely escaped, reportedly leaping onto a fishing boat and fleeing downstream. Thousands were captured, including Jean de Nevers and countless nobles. The field of Nicopolis was a scene of utter desolation. Broken lances, shattered shields, and the corpses of Europe's finest littered the slopes. The stench of blood and death hung heavy. The aftermath was humiliation. Bayezid, enraged by the heavy Ottoman losses, including his own son-in-law, ordered a mass execution of prisoners. Thousands of captives were beheaded before the Sultan's tent, their bodies left unburied. Only the highest nobles were spared for ransom. Jean de Nevers endured a year of captivity before Burgundy paid a king's ransom. The crusade was annihilated. Bayezid's power seemed unassailable, his threat to Constantinople and Hungary magnified. The dream of rolling back the Ottoman tide lay shattered on the bloody fields of Nicopolis. The Battle of Nicopolis wasn't just a defeat, it was the death knell of the medieval crusading ideal. It exposed the fatal disconnect between chivalric arrogance and the harsh realities of modern warfare. Europe learned, in blood and fire, that courage without wisdom was a path to ruin. The thunderbolt had struck, and Christendom reeled, its pride broken, its future uncertain. The long shadow of the crescent moon grew darker over the Balkans, cast by the setting sun of Nicopolis. Story number 18, The Battle of Visby, 1361 Massacre on Gotland. July 27, 1361. The Baltic sun beat down mercilessly on Gotland's rocky fields. Outside the walled merchant town of Visby, fear hung thick as the island's dust. King Valdemar Atterdag of Denmark, a ruthless conqueror hungry for wealth and dominion, had come. His army, 2,500 hardened professional soldiers, Danish knights in gleaming mail, German mercenaries, the feared Vitalienbrüder, seasoned crossbowmen, represented the terrifying might of a rising kingdom. Opposing them stood not an army, but a desperate gathering, Visby's citizens, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, alongside untrained Gotlandic peasants, hastily assembled levies from the countryside. Barely 2,000 strong, poorly armed, clad in outdated gear or simple clothes, they represented everything Valdemar despised, wealthy independence refusing his yoke. The air crackled not with the clang of steel yet, but with the dread of the inevitable. Gotland was rich. Visby, a vital Hanseatic port, pulsed with trade. Its coin filled Valdemar's coffers. His demand was simple: submit or be crushed. The proud Gotlanders, long autonomous, chose defiance. They barred the gates. Valdemar landed unopposed, his troops fresh from ravaging the island's southern villages. He marched north towards the prize. The Gotlanders knew a siege meant slow death. Foolishly, perhaps bravely, they marched out to meet him on open ground near Failmere, just south of the city walls. They hoped their numbers and home ground might suffice. They were tragically wrong. Valdemar, a master of shock and terror, saw his opportunity. He deployed his veterans with chilling efficiency. Crossbowmen formed the front, their steel-tipped bolts knocked. Behind them, disciplined ranks of heavily armored infantry and knights formed an impenetrable wall of steel and shields. The Danish king himself, likely clad in his finest plate, surveyed the ragged Gotlandic lines with contempt. The contrast was grotesque: professional killers facing farmers wielding axes and spears, some still in their work clothes. Valdemar gave the order. The crossbowmen stepped forward. A deadly whisper filled the air, then a sharp twang as hundreds of bolts arced skyward. The effect was instantaneous carnage. The Gotlandic front ranks dissolved. Bolts punched through thin leather, homespun wool, finding flesh and bone with sickening thuds. Men screamed, fell, trampled by those behind trying to retreat or advance. Panic, raw and primal, ripped through the untrained defenders before the Danish knights had even moved. Valdemar unleashed his infantry. A roar went up as the Danish and German professionals advanced, shields locked, spears lowered. They crashed into the reeling Gotlanders like a tidal wave hitting driftwood. What followed was less a battle than a slaughterhouse. The Gotlanders fought with desperate, hopeless courage. Farmers swung scythes and axes, merchants thrust with spears. But courage couldn't bridge the chasm of experience, armor, and discipline. Danish swords and axes rose and fell with brutal efficiency. Knights on horseback charged into the flanks, cutting down fleeing men. The Gotlandic lines shattered, fragmented into pockets of doomed resistance. The cries were not war cries, but screams of terror and agony. The field became a killing ground, churned mud darkening with blood. The Gotlanders broke. A terrified rout surged back towards Visby's walls, less than 2 kilometers away. It was a death run. Danish and German soldiers pursued relentlessly, cutting down stragglers without mercy. Crossbowmen picked off those lagging behind. The slaughter reached the very gates of Visby itself. Some defenders tried to make a desperate last stand in the lee of the walls. Others pounded on the barred gates, screaming for sanctuary. But Visby's council, witnessing the annihilation outside, refused to open them. Letting the rampaging Danes inside meant the city's certain fall. The choice was brutal, pragmatic, and condemned hundreds to death outside their own walls. The final, horrific act unfolded near the city's main entrance, the Osterport. Cornered, exhausted, and overwhelmed, the surviving Gotlanders, perhaps several hundred, made their last stand clustered around the modest chapel of Solberga, just outside the walls. They fought back to back, farmers and burghers alike, using the chapel walls for scant cover. It was a sacrifice, not a strategy. Valdemar's troops surrounded them. Crossbow bolts rained down. Armored soldiers closed in, hacking and stabbing. Resistance crumbled swiftly. The chapel grounds became an abattoir. When the killing stopped, the fields south of Visby and the approaches to its walls were carpeted with the dead and dying. Estimates range from 1,800 to 2,000 Gotlanders slain, virtually their entire fighting force. Danish losses were minimal. The next day, July 28th, Visby surrendered unconditionally. Valdemar entered the city he had broken without a siege. His price was staggering, the town's immense wealth. Citizens were forced to empty their coffers, churches stripped of silver and gold, merchants ruined. 3 enormous beer vats were filled to the brim with silver coin, jewelry, and plate before Valdemar departed, leaving Gotland broken and bleeding. The Battle of Visby was a stark, brutal lesson in the changing nature of war, the helplessness of citizen levies against a professional, merciless army. It wasn't a clash of heroes, but an industrial massacre. Centuries later, the silence still echoes. Archaeological digs unearthed mass graves near Visby's walls, grim confirmation of the slaughter. Skeletons lie piled, many bearing horrific wounds, skulls split by axes, limbs severed, bodies pierced by crossbow bolts still embedded in bone. Farmers still clad in chain mail over their tunics, cut down beside wealthier burghers. These graves are Visby's true monument, not crumbling walls. They speak of a sunny July day when a king's greed met a people's defiance, and the fields ran red. The Battle of Visby remains a stark, visceral testament to the crushing weight of medieval power, the fragility of independence, and the terrible price paid in blood on a quiet island in the Baltic Sun. The skeletons whisper still, a chilling reminder of Valdemar's victory and Gotland's agony. Story last, the Siege of Granada, 1491 to 1492, the last sigh of Al-Andalus. December 1491. The snow-dusted hills of the Vega cradled a dying dream. Granada, the jewel of Al-Andalus, stood isolated, the last flickering ember of Islamic Spain. For 7 centuries, the Nasrid dynasty had held court in the sublime Alhambra, its red walls a defiant symbol of faith and culture. Now, the relentless might of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, pressed in. Their massive encampment, Santa Fe, Holy Faith, a city of tents and determination, choked the fertile plain. 150,000 soldiers, hardened Castilian infantry, Aragonese knights, Swiss mercenaries, and the thunder of modern siege artillery encircled the city. Inside, Sultan Boabdil, Muhammad XII, trapped between despair and defiant pride, ruled a fractured court and a starving populace. The Reconquista's final act had begun. Granada's natural defenses were formidable, ringed by mountains, protected by stout walls and watchtowers. But years of internal strife, tribute payments bleeding the treasury dry, and the relentless Christian advance had sapped its strength. Ferdinand, the master strategist, employed not just force, but suffocation. He ordered the Tala, the systematic destruction of Granada's vital orchards, vineyards, and croplands. Starvation gnawed at the city's soul. Winter's bite intensified the misery. Boabdil launched desperate cavalry sorties, flashes of brilliance quickly extinguished by the disciplined Christian ranks. Hope dwindled like the last grains in the granaries. The thunder of Spanish bombards, Los Reyes, the kings, and La Giralda relentlessly pounded the Albaycin quarter, a constant reminder of the inevitable. The Alhambra itself, though seemingly impregnable high on its hill, felt the tremors. Its courtyards, once echoing with poetry and water, now whispered of betrayal and surrender. Boabdil's mother, Aixa, famously scorned her son. "Weep like a woman for the kingdom you could not defend like a man." The Sultan, torn between his people's suffering and the crushing weight of history, secretly negotiated. Ferdinand, sensing victory, offered terms: surrender the city, convert or leave, guarantees for property and faith for a time. The promises were laced with the steel of conquest. Boabdil hesitated, clinging to sovereignty's shadow. January 1492. The endgame. Ferdinand tightened the noose. Spanish sappers tunneled towards key bastions. Artillery concentrated fire, breaching walls near the Puerta del Vera. A fierce, final assault seemed imminent. The people of Granada, cold, hungry, and witnessing their walls crumble, could endure no more. Pressure mounted on Boabdil. On January 2, 1492, the Sultan rode out of the Alhambra's gate of justice for the last time. He met Ferdinand and Isabella at a spot still known as El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's Sigh. Tradition claims he turned for one last, tearful look at his lost paradise. He handed over the keys to the city and the Alhambra. "These are the keys to paradise," he reportedly uttered. Ferdinand took them. "We are well content." The Catholic monarchs entered Granada in triumph. Castilian banners unfurled from the highest tower of the Alhambra, the Torre de la Vela. The silver cross and the banner of St. James fluttered where the crescent had flown for 781 years. Priests held aloft a great crucifix, blessing the conquered city. Isabella knelt in the dirt, giving thanks to God. The royal procession wound through streets heavy not with celebration, but with stunned silence and muffled grief. The terms of surrender promised tolerance, but the air crackled with the unspoken tension of forced conversion and the looming shadow of the Inquisition. The surrender of Granada resonated far beyond Spain. It marked the end of the Reconquista, a centuries-long crusade concluded. It unified Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, forging a nation poised for global empire. For the Muslim world, it was a profound loss, the extinguishing of a brilliant, enduring civilization in the West. The Alhambra stood as a breathtaking monument to what was lost, its intricate plasterwork and serene courtyards a silent reproach to the victors. Boabdil, granted a small lordship in the Alpujarras Mountains, soon fled to North Africa, a broken king in exile. The siege of Granada wasn't a bloody climax, but a negotiated surrender born of exhaustion and overwhelming force. Yet, its significance was earth-shattering. It closed the medieval chapter of Iberia. It funded Columbus's voyage later that year, launching Europe into a new age. And it sowed the seeds of future tragedy: the forced conversions, the Alpujarras revolts, the eventual expulsion of the Moriscos. The last sigh of Al-Andalus echoed long after the gates closed, a poignant farewell to a world of convivencia that vanished beneath the banners of the cross. The Reconquista was complete, but the cost to Spain's soul and the legacy of a lost paradise reflected in the Alhambra's pools would endure forever. The keys to paradise had changed hands, and the world shifted on its axis.